Chapter 51. Director Kang's Questions. She came to him on the second morning before the facility's daily formation checks, when the corridors were quiet, and the only sound was the river outside the eastern wall running over its stones. She did not knock. The door was not locked. She simply opened it and stood in the frame with a posture that was not aggressive but was very deliberate, and said, "I want to understand the unbound array theory." Wei Liang had been sitting cross-legged on the bed, running the post-flow channel assessment he did every morning now, checking the new geometry against the previous day's reading. He opened his eyes and looked at her. Director Kang was a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years building institutional competence, and the specific expression of someone whose institution had just turned out to be built on ground she had not examined. It was not a comfortable expression. She was wearing it anyway, which told him something useful about her. "Sit down," he said, and gestured to the room's single chair. She sat. He explained the unbound array theory from its foundations, the way Van Byken's scale models had shown it to him, the way his own extension of the geometry had resolved the structural limit. He drew on the room's floor with chalk he had asked Deng Hu for the previous evening, working through the principles with the patience of someone who had spent months understanding this well enough to apply it under pressure. She followed carefully. She asked precise questions. He revised 2 assumptions she had brought from conventional formation theory, and watched her incorporate the revisions without resistance, the way a good engineer accepts new data. After an hour, she said, the Bureau's formation engineers would classify this as Tier 3 prohibited knowledge. Yes, because it undermines the spirit stone market. That is the commercial reason, he said. The stated reason is formation instability risk. Is there a formation instability risk in improperly scaled implementations? Yes. The same is true of every formation system, including the Bureau's standard arrays. He paused. The difference is that the Bureau's arrays fail in ways that damage the people nearby and leave the Bureau's authority intact. Van Byken's arrays fail gracefully, dissipating into the ambient. They are safer. They were prohibited because they were cheaper and safer, not because they were dangerous. Director Kang was quiet for a moment. Outside, the river continued. "The register," she said. "The destruction technique. I want you to know that I was told it caused temporary suppression. I was not told it caused permanent damage." "I know," he said. "I believe you." She looked at him with an expression that contained the specific quality of a person who has been given an absolution they were not sure they deserved and was uncertain what to do with it. "What do you want?" she asked. Not the broad answer. Specifically. "From me, from this facility, right now. A message sent to the senior Bureau leadership," he said, "through official channels under your signature. Requesting an emergency convening of the Inter-Sect Oversight Assembly to review the Bureau's foundational charter in light of the register's contents. That will end my career. It may," he said, "or it may define it. The Oversight Assembly has not been convened in 40 years. The register has now been read by every sect of significance. The pressure to convene it was building before you sent any message. Your message would be the one that made the convening official." She was quiet for a long time. "Deng Hu thinks you are right," she said finally, not quite looking at him. "I know. He said as much on the road. He is a good agent and a better person than the Bureau deserved." She stood. "I will think about the message. Give me until evening." She left. He returned to his channel assessment, and the river outside the wall ran on, indifferent and steady, the way rivers ran regardless of what people decided in the rooms beside them. Chapter 52. Yu King moves first. Yu King did not wait for Director Kang's answer. While Wei Liang was in his room and Song Fei was composing in hers, Yu King had spent the first 2 days of their custody doing what she had been trained for, gathering and organizing information. identifying leverage points, and building a communication structure that did not depend on any single node. The facility's library was accessible to cooperative custody detainees. The library's communication Jade terminal was accessible to library users. The communication Jade terminal was, through a chain of connections that Yu King mapped in 4 hours, linked to the general cultivation world's information network, which was linked to the contact network's secondary relay points, which were linked to the 17 nodes that still held copies of the register, and were now also holding copies of everything Yu King had taken from the Iron Mirror Fortress's archive. On the morning of the second day, she sent 3 messages. The first was to Master Wen Suli at Verdant Canopy, through an oblique channel that would not be traceable to the facility, a precise account of the Iron Mirror operation, the unbound array theory, and the primordial flow event with documentation attached. Not a request for assistance. A briefing. Yu King was no longer asking her sect for anything. She was informing them of what had happened and what would happen next. The second was to Elder Hu in Ironbell City, through the contact network's relay, an update on their status, and a request to activate the network's public communication structure. The one she and Elder Hu had spent 6 weeks building, which could distribute information to independent cultivators across 4 prefectures simultaneously. The third was to Shen Guozin, through the sign network, 2 words in the old man's private cipher. They translated as, "It worked." She closed the terminal, returned the library book she had not been reading, and walked back to her room with the particular quality of stillness of someone who has completed the work they came to do and is now waiting for the consequences to arrive. The consequences began arriving by afternoon. The Azure Hollow sect issued a public statement calling for an emergency convening of the Inter-Sect Oversight Assembly, citing the Register and the Iron Mirror event. They were the 3rd sect to do so. The first 2 had issued their calls within hours of the Register's release. The Azure Hollow statement was notable because it named the Iron Mirror Fortress explicitly and described the Unbound Array event in accurate technical detail, which meant their information had come from someone with direct knowledge. Wai Ru had been at the Azure Hollow sect's outer compound. She had told Wai Liang in her second letter that she would not hide what she knew. She had not hidden it. Yu King read the Azure Hollow statement through the library terminal in the evening, and then sat with it for a moment, looking at the words, thinking about a girl she had never met who had made a choice at considerable personal cost because she had decided it was right. She wrote a 4th message that evening, personal rather than operational. She addressed it to Wai Liang through the thin wall between their rooms by the simple method of knocking twice. He knocked back, he had heard. He knew. She returned to her notes. Outside, the facility settled into its night routine, and somewhere in the Broken Tooth Mountains 400 li north, a young Azure Hollow disciple was explaining to her sect's elders exactly what she knew and how she knew it. And the road that Wai Liang had been walking alone for 4 years was becoming, piece by piece, a road that others were also choosing to walk. Chapter 53. The Message Goes Out. Director Kang sent the message at sunset. Wai Liang felt it through the facility's formation network the moment the communication jade activated, a pulse of official Kai's signature moving outward along the Bureau's internal relay toward the senior leadership. He could not read the message's contents, but he could read its weight, the amount of Kai invested in the sending, the priority classification, the range of its distribution. She had sent it to every senior bureau officer simultaneously, not just the leadership. She had also, he noticed from the formation signature, sent a copy through a different channel that was not the Bureau's internal relay. The Oversight Assembly, probably. He heard her footsteps in the corridor an hour later, passing his door without stopping. The footsteps had a different quality than they had in the morning. Not lighter, not heavier. Clearer. The Bureau's response came before dawn, not to the facility, to the information networks. The Bureau's senior leadership, apparently deciding that the message from one of their own directors was the threshold past which silence became untenable, issued a public statement that was, in Wei Liang's assessment, the most revealing thing the Bureau had produced in 5 centuries. It attempted 4 things simultaneously. It questioned the register's authenticity. It justified the channel destruction technique as a necessary safety measure. It framed the Iron Mirror event as a dangerous attack on essential infrastructure. And it called for Wei Liang's immediate surrender to face charges. Each of these 4 positions directly contradicted at least one of the others. You could not simultaneously claim the register was fabricated and justify the actions the register described. You could not claim the Iron Mirror event was a dangerous attack and also describe Wei Liang as a minor anomaly that any patrol could handle. The statement had been written by several people with different priorities and assembled without sufficient time to reconcile them. The contradictions were visible to anyone reading carefully. Yu King read the statement through the library terminal at dawn and sent a copy to every node in the network with a single annotation, "Read in full." Song Fei, when shown the statement over the facility's morning meal, read it twice and then said, "They are frightened. This is what frightened institutions sound like." Yes, Wei Liang agreed. Frightened institutions are dangerous, she said, not as a warning, as a fact. Yes, he agreed again, which is why the next step matters. They need to be given a path that is not capitulation. No institution will accept pure defeat. They need something they can call a transition. Yu King looked at him across the table. You have been thinking about this since before the fortress, since Shen Guo told me about the Bureau's founding, he said. The first-generation leadership believed their own safety rationale. Their successors inherited the monopoly without the original justification. If you remove the monopoly and restore the safety function, you have something the Bureau can become rather than something it has to stop being. An oversight body with genuine, rather than manufactured authority, Yu King said slowly. One that actually regulates for safety rather than for commercial protection. One with representatives from outside the major sects. One with a public record. He looked at his tea. It is not a perfect solution. It is a solution that might survive contact with the actual people who have to implement it. Song Fei was quiet for a moment. Then, you had better write that down. The Oversight Assembly will want a proposal, not just a problem. He wrote it down. He had most of it already drafted in his mind, had been drafting it in the quiet hours of the past 2 nights. By mid-morning it was on paper, precise and detailed and thoroughly grounded in the register's evidence. By afternoon, Yu King had edited it into the specific language that institutional documents required and could respond to. By evening, it was moving through the network. Chapter 54, Shen Guo arrives. The old man arrived at the facility on the 4th day, which surprised Wei Liang considerably. He had not expected Shen Guo to leave the inn. He had understood the old man's role as the shelter, the fixed point, the keeper of what was preserved. But the figure who appeared at the facility's outer gate in the late afternoon, wearing travel clothes rather than his usual indoor robes and carrying a small pack with the ease of someone who had traveled long distances before, was unmistakably Shen Guo. Director Kang admitted him after a brief conversation at the gate. Whatever was said, the director's Kai signature carried the quality of someone adjusting a position they had already been reconsidering. Shen Guo found Wei Liang's room and sat in the chair with the settled comfort of someone who had been sitting in chairs for 80 years and found most of them adequate. You are not supposed to be here, Wei Liang said. The inn is being maintained by 2 of its residents who are quite capable, Shen Guo said. I received Yu King's message and decided that the shelter could spare its keeper for a period. He looked at Wei Liang with those stone-gray eyes. Also, I wanted to see you before the assembly convenes. Several conversations I should have had with you earlier, about the 9th stage, about what comes after it. Shen Guo folded his hands in his lap. I reached the 9th stage at 61 years old. I had spent 40 years preparing, and I was still not fully prepared, as my hand demonstrates. I was alone. There was no one to explain what had happened or what it meant for what I was afterward. A pause. You are 16 and you have done it in 4 years and you have people around you. The afterward will be different for you. I want to make sure you understand what the afterward is. Tell me. The primordial flow, once channeled, does not leave, Shen Guo said. You know this already, you can feel it. The hum beneath everything. That is permanent. You are now, for the rest of your life, a channel for something that has no element, no framework, no classification in any system the sects have built. He paused. In a crowd of cultivators, you will be detectable. Not as a threat, not as an anomaly, as something they have no name for. Experienced practitioners will feel the hum and not know what it is, and that uncertainty will produce reactions you cannot always predict. Fear, Wei Liang said. Sometimes. Sometimes reverence. Sometimes the particular hostility of people who are disturbed by things they cannot categorize. Shen Guo's voice was level. You will need to be patient with all of these reactions. They are not reasonable, but they are human. Wei Liang absorbed this. What else? Your channel capacity has changed. You know the loss, you have assessed it. What you may not yet know is the gain. Shen Guo looked at him steadily. The flow scoured and widened. What it widened is larger now than any conventional cultivator's meridians at your equivalent stage. The depth of the hollow is greater. You can channel more Kai per unit time than you could before, with more precision and less effort. Not because you have more power in the conventional sense. Because the river has a wider, smoother course. The road improved itself by running, Wei Liang said. Yes. Which is, the old man said with that precise small smile, the most accurate description of the hollow road I have ever heard. You should write it down. Chapter 55, The Oversight Assembly convenes. The Inter-Sect Oversight Assembly convened 12 days after the Iron Mirror event, in a neutral location, the River Gate Conference Hall in the prefectural capital, a building that had been built specifically for this kind of convening 200 years ago and had stood mostly empty since. 19 sects sent representatives. 5 of the major sects sent their senior elders. 12 minor and mid-tier sects sent a mix of elders and information branch disciples. 2 sects sent observers without voting authority, which told Yu King they were waiting to see which way the current ran before committing their position. The Bureau sent 3 senior officers, one of whom was a deputy whose appointment had been made 3 days ago, which suggested that at least one senior director had been quietly reassigned following Director Kang's message. Director Kang herself was present. She sat in the observer's gallery rather than the Bureau's delegation, which was a statement that required no words. Wei Liang, Yu King, Song Fei, and Shen Guo attended as independent witnesses, a classification that had required 4 hours of procedural argument the previous day, and had been resolved when the Azure Hollow Sect's representative pointed out that the Assembly's founding charter explicitly provided for independent witnesses in cases involving disputed Bureau authority, a provision that had not been used in 200 years, but was technically still valid. Wei Ru was not present, but the Azure Hollow Sect statement, entered into the Assembly's record before the opening session, was thorough, accurate, and clearly written by someone who understood both the cultivation and the political dimensions of what had happened. Wei Liang read it the night before and recognized, in its precise and quietly certain voice, the quality of a person who had decided who they were. The first session lasted 9 hours. The register was entered into evidence. Yu King presented it, from memory, in the format that institutional proceedings required, and answered questions for 3 hours with the flat, documented precision of a former information disciple who had prepared for exactly this. Every question aimed at the register's authenticity met a complete answer. The Bureau's deputy attempted, twice, to raise the issue of Yu King's status as a destroyed channel practitioner operating without sect authorization. Both times, the Assembly's chair ruled the issue inadmissible on the grounds that the proceedings concerned the Bureau's authority rather than any individual's compliance with that authority. The second time, 3 senior elders from different sects visibly agreed with the ruling before it was finished being stated. The unbound array theory was presented next. Wei Liang presented it, which required him to stand at the front of a hall containing some of the most powerful cultivators in 4 prefectures and speak clearly about something that the Bureau classified as Tier 3 prohibited knowledge. He did not suppress the primordial flow's hum. He let every sensitive practitioner in the hall feel it, and he watched them register it and adjust, and he kept his voice level and precise and did not hurry. The hum was more persuasive than anything he could say. You could argue with a person's words. You could not argue with a direct sensory experience of something that your entire framework told you was impossible, and yet was clearly present, calm, and unharmful. By the end of the first session, 4 of the 5 major sect elders had submitted formal requests for the unbound array theory's reclassification from prohibited to restricted research. It was not victory. It was the shape of a door opening. Chapter 56. What the Bureau offers. The Bureau's concession came on the 3rd day of the Assembly, presented by their deputy in language so carefully structured that it took Yu King 20 minutes to map all the things it was not saying. They would acknowledge that the channel destruction technique had been applied more broadly than its original safety mandate specified. They would commission an independent review of the technique's historical use. They would suspend its use pending the review. They would acknowledge that the register existed and that some of its entries might reflect enforcement actions that exceeded the Bureau's founding charter. They would not acknowledge that the charter itself was built on a false premise. They would not acknowledge that the suppressed methods were suppressed for commercial rather than safety reasons. They would not accept the proposal for restructuring that Wei Liang and Yu King had circulated. They are offering a review and a pause, Song Fei said in the evening, when the 4 of them sat in their temporary quarters near the Assembly Hall. Not a change. It is what frightened institutions offer when they want to appear cooperative without surrendering authority, Yu King said. It is also the first public acknowledgement that anything was wrong, which they have never made before. Is it enough? Shen Guo asked. The question landed as most of the important questions did with Wei Liang. He had been sitting quietly since they returned from the day's session, running the channel assessment, processing the day with the methodical patience that was now simply his nature. No, he said, it is not enough. But it is a real thing, not a nothing. A review can produce real findings. A suspension can become a permanent end. The Oversight Assembly now exists as an active body rather than a dormant one, which means the Bureau's actions will be examined by people outside the Bureau for the first time in 40 years. He looked at the window, at the night sky above the prefectural capital. We needed the road to open, not to be handed to us completed. A road that was handed to us would belong to whoever handed it. This way, it has to be built. Yu King was quiet for a moment. That is a very patient position for someone who was being hunted 3 weeks ago. The hollow road is a patient road, he said. It does not fill. It waits for what flows through. Song Fei looked at him with the expression she had worn in the Iron Mirror Fortress when composing her witness account. I am writing that down, she said. Write whatever is useful, he said. What comes next? Yu King opened her notebook. The Assembly votes tomorrow on 3 motions: the Register's formal entry into the historical record, the suspension of the channel destruction technique, and the establishment of a permanent oversight committee with non-bureau membership. The votes are not certain, but based on today's session, the first 2 will pass. The third is close. What does the third need? One more senior sect to declare support publicly tonight. The 2 observers who have been waiting. Which one is more likely to move? She named a sect. He thought about its representative, whom he had watched carefully during the session. He thought about what the representative had felt when the primordial flow's hum moved through the hall, the particular quality of recognition that had crossed a face usually very controlled. I will speak to them tonight, he said. Not about politics, about what they felt. Chapter 57. A Conversation Under Stars. The representative's name was Elder Fang Liuking of the Drifting Pine sect, a mid-tier sect from the Western Ranges with a reputation for philosophical conservatism, and an internal tradition of what their curriculum called still cultivation, which was why Liang had learned from Shen Guo, one of the Hollow Road's distant cousins. Not the same path, a path that rhymed. He found her on the Assembly Hall's eastern terrace after the evening meal, alone, standing at the railing and looking at the river that ran below the prefectural capital's eastern wall. She was aware of him before he reached the terrace. He felt her spirit sense adjust when he came within range, the precise note of someone encountering the primordial flow's hum at close proximity and spending a moment with it before returning to their surroundings. Ghost Cultivator 7, she said without turning. Why Liang, he said, I prefer it. Why Liang? She turned. She was older than Shen Guo by appearance, with the particular quality of long-practiced stillness that the Hollow Road's practitioners shared across their different paths. You felt me during the session today. Your still cultivation practice, he said. Yes, it rhymes with mine. Not the same, but related. We call it the mountain quiet method. It is 300 years old and has been classified as an approved minor variation of the Earth Root curriculum by every bureau review since its founding. She looked at the river. It rhymes with yours, as you say. I have always wondered why. The bureau's reviews never had an answer. Because your method and mine are both approximations of the same deeper principle, he said. The 5-element framework is one vocabulary for describing how Kai moves. Your method found an aspect of the truth that the vocabulary struggles to express. Mine found a different aspect. Neither of us invented the principle. We found different paths to it. Elder Fang was quiet. The hum I felt in the hall, she said finally. That was the principle itself, the primordial flow. Yes, it felt like the foundation of the mountain quiet method, the thing the method has always been pointing toward without reaching. It is, he said. Your practitioners have been walking toward it for 300 years. The Bureau's classification as an approved minor variation was correct in recognizing the method was not dangerous. It was wrong in not understanding what the method was actually doing. Another long quiet. The river below the wall ran silver in the moonlight. The Permanent Oversight Committee, she said. Yes. If I declare tonight the third motion passes, yes. What does the Drifting Pine sect gain from a bureau that is accountable to an oversight committee? The same thing every practitioner gains, he said. The freedom to practice what you practice without fear, that a classification review will change its status based on commercial considerations rather than safety ones. The mountain quiet method is 300 years old and has harmed no one. It should not exist at the Bureau's sufferance. She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she turned from the railing and looked at him directly. How old are you? She asked. 16. Something moved through her expression that he did not have a precise name for. It had the quality of things reassessing themselves in light of new information. "When this is over," she said, "I would like to have a longer conversation about the relationship between the mountain quiet method and the hollow road. I think there is significant shared ground that has not been mapped." "So would I," he said with complete honesty. She nodded once and walked back inside. He stayed on the terrace for a while, looking at the river. Tomorrow the third motion would pass. An oversight committee would exist. The Bureau would be accountable, not eliminated, which was the right outcome even though it was a less satisfying one than elimination. And somewhere in the quiet of several different evenings, 3 separate people had chosen to move because a rootless boy from Ash Valley had simply told them what was true. The road kept opening. Chapter 58, The Vote. All 3 motions passed. The register was entered into the historical record with a formal note that its contents represented documented Bureau actions that exceeded the founding charter's authority. The vote was 17-2, with the 2 dissenting votes coming from sects with direct commercial ties to the Blackwater sect's spirit stone operations. The channel destruction technique was suspended pending independent review, with a provision that any use of the technique in the interim required approval from the newly formed Oversight Committee. The vote was 15-4. The Permanent Oversight Committee was established by a vote of 12-7, with the 2 former observers both voting in favor. Elder Fang Liuqing was among the first nominees for the committee's independent seat. The Bureau's deputy signed the Assembly's resolutions without speaking. His face held the expression of someone completing a task they had been sent to complete and reserving judgment on the task for a private moment later. Director Kang, from the observer's gallery, held no expression at all. She was very still, the way stone was still. Afterward, in the Assembly Hall side chamber where the independent witnesses were permitted to wait while the formal record was being prepared, Yu King sat with her notebook and did not write anything. This was unusual enough that Wei Liang noticed it and said nothing, waiting. "I have been thinking," she said eventually, "about what I am now." He waited. "I was a verdant canopy information disciple. My sect burned my channels and left me for dead. I have spent 9 months building something that has just, in one sense, succeeded." She looked at the notebook's closed cover. Verdant Canopy's representative voted in favor of all 3 motions. "Master Wen sent me a message this morning, through the official sect channel, formally reinstating my disciple status and requesting that I return to the sect when my current obligations allow. What will you do?" "I do not know," she said, which was the most uncertain he had heard her sound about anything since they had met. "The sect that reinstated me is not quite the sect that destroyed me. Master Wen has moved it, but it is still a sect, still an institution, still a structure with its own interests and constraints." She paused. "I built the earth and water method on my own, the unsanctioned method. I am not the same practitioner I was before." "No," he agreed. "The information branch with access to the Oversight Committee's work, with the contact network's infrastructure already in place." She paused again. "There is a version of the next 10 years in which I build something that is not quite a sect, and not quite the contact network, and not quite the Bureau. Something new. Something that exists in the space that the Oversight Committee creates. That is exactly what is needed," he said. She looked at him. "You say that as if you knew I would arrive at it." "I did not know," he said honestly, "but I thought you might. You have always been building something. The register, the distribution plan, the network structure. You build things that outlast the crisis that required them." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she opened the notebook and began to write. Chapter 59, What Song Fei Writes. Song Fei's account was finished on the 6th day after the assembly, in the quiet of the temporary quarters while Wei Liang was in a follow-up session with the Oversight Committee, and Yu King was drafting the structure of what would become her new organization. She had been writing it since the Iron Mirror Fortress, and it was not a short document. It covered the history of the Hollow Road from the earliest records she had preserved, through the Resonant Mountain School's founding and destruction, through 4 generations of keeping to the present. It covered what she had witnessed in the past 3 months with the precision of a woman who had understood, from the moment she met Wei Liang and Yu King, that she was witnessing something that needed to be remembered accurately. It also included, in a final section she had not planned when she began writing, a personal account. Not what she had seen, but what she had felt, standing in the Iron Mirror Fortress's corridor while the primordial flow moved through the central chamber, feeling it through the walls as a vibration that her stone and voice method recognized the way a key recognizes a lock. She had not published the Mountain Quiet Method's relationship to the Hollow Road in any previous account. She published it now, plainly, with the full technical detail her 50 years of practice had developed, not as evidence, as a gift. She knocked on Yu King's door when it was done. Yu King read it in 2 hours. When she came out, she found Song Fei drinking tea in the common room with the particular contentment of someone who has completed the work they were given to do in this life. "This should go everywhere," Yu King said. "That was my intention," Song Fei said. "The network can carry it. So can the Assembly's formal record if the Oversight Committee accepts it as supporting documentation for the Register's historical context." "They will accept it," Yu King said, with the flat certainty of someone who had spent the past week in Assembly sessions and understood which direction things were moving. The committee chair specifically asked yesterday whether there were surviving accounts from practitioners of suppressed lineages. "I told her there might be." Song Fei sipped her tea. "I also wrote something else." Shorter. She produced a second document, 3 pages, written in clear and careful script. It was addressed to the Resonant Mountain School, which did not currently exist and was structured as a school founding document, curriculum, principles, admission requirements, founding philosophy. "You are reopening the school," Yu King said. "My ancestor built it 260 years ago and the Bureau destroyed it." 2 students came back and carved names into the walls. Song Fei set down her tea. "I am 73 years old and I have been keeping for 50 years. It is time to stop keeping and start building." She looked at Yu King steadily. "I would like to ask Wei Liang if he would be willing to be named in the founding document, not as a teacher, as a lineage holder. A formal connection between the Hollow Road's history and what the school will teach." Yu King was quiet for a moment. "He will say yes." "I know," Song Fei said. "But it is courteous to ask." Chapter 60. The Road Ahead. Wei Liang left the prefectural capital on a morning 12 days after the assembly concluded, with the specific quality of lightness that comes not from having no burdens, but from having put down the ones you had been carrying and accepted different ones that fit better. The Oversight Committee was operational. Its first session had been spent establishing procedural rules and was, in Yu King's assessment, exactly as tedious and necessary as institutional beginnings always were. The Bureau was in a transitional state that she described as controlled disassembly, which meant that some people were leaving quietly, some were staying and recalibrating, and a few were resisting in ways that the committee was learning to address. The Register was in the historical record and in the public network simultaneously. Song Fei's account was circulating through every channel the contact network could reach. The unbound array theory was classified as restricted research, which meant it could be studied by credentialed practitioners, which meant that, within a generation, it would be known widely enough that restricting it would become meaningless. Yu King was staying in the prefectural capital for the near term, building the structure she had described in the assembly hall's side chamber. She had accepted Verdant Canopy's reinstatement on specific terms that Master Wen had agreed to, which gave her sect affiliation when institutional access required it and independence when her actual work required it. It was, Wei Liang thought, very like her, a precise solution to a constraint that most people would have resolved by simply choosing one side. Shen Guo was returning to the inn. He had said his goodbyes the previous evening over a meal that the facility's kitchen had prepared at Director Kang's request, in a small room with good light and the river audible through the window. The meal had been simple, and the conversation had been good, and Wei Liang had understood, sitting across from the old man, that this was one of the forms that inheritance took, not a formal passing of anything, but the specific quality of a shared meal between two people who had walked the same road in different generations and recognized each other. Song Fei had already departed 3 days ago for the old school building in the southern foothills. She had a founding document, a curriculum, and a list of potential students that had grown, through the contact network, from 4 names to 31 in the past week. She had left Wei Liang a copy of the founding document with his name on it, and he had held it for a long time before putting it in his inner pocket next to the 2 letters from Wei Ru. He walked north from the prefectural capital along the road toward the Broken Tooth Mountains. Not because he needed to return to Ash Valley. He had no particular need to return. But the Nameless River Method's complete text was now in the Oversight Committee's hands for safekeeping, and Wei Liang had realized in the past week that the method he had been practicing for 4 years was not finished. The 9 stages were not the road's end. They were the road's beginning. The primordial flow moved through him constantly now, at its natural level, the hum beneath everything. He was learning, slowly and carefully, to not just bear it but to understand it. What it was, where it came from, what the 9 stages had actually been preparing him for. The ancient practitioner who had left the cache had died without reaching the answer. Shen Guo had reached it partially, and the cost had been significant. Wei Liang had reached it at 16 with the full preparation the vial had provided, and his channels were changed but intact, and the road had not ended. It had widened. The Broken Tooth Mountains appeared on the horizon in the late afternoon, the jagged skyline he had grown up looking at, smaller now from this distance than they had seemed from the valley floor of Ash Valley, but still unmistakably themselves. The mountains that had been his first training ground, his first source of the patterns he had learned to read, the place where a stone-backed tiger had walked away from him with something like respect. He was not going back to who he had been. You could not go back. The river did not run uphill. But there was something in the mountains that he wanted to find, the ancient battlefield where he had first practiced absorbing Kai patterns from stone. The place where the pre-sect era had left its residue in the rock, where practitioners who had walked roads before the sects existed had fought and left the shapes of their methods behind. He had read those shapes as a child with no method and no direction. He wanted to read them again now, with the 6th stage and the primordial flow and 4 years of the road behind him. He did not know what he would find. That was the right condition for finding it. He walked into the long northern afternoon, the mountains growing ahead of him, the road rolling out through fields that were green with late summer, and he let the hollow be what it was, open and patient and moving through the world with the ease of something that had found its nature and was no longer fighting it. Somewhere behind him, Yu King was building a structure that would outlast both of them. Somewhere to the south, Song Fei was opening a school that had been closed for 260 years. Somewhere in a mountain compound, Shen Guo was feeding his serpent and reading and preserving, the fixed point that the moving points needed. Somewhere in an azure hollow outer compound, Wei Ru was living with the consequences of a choice she had made clearly, which was the only way to live with a choice. And in the register, now public and permanent, were thousands of names. People who had walked roads and been stopped. People whose methods had been destroyed before they could be passed on. People who had come back and carved names into walls because they could not do anything else. Wei Liang walked north and felt them, distantly, the way you feel the weight of things that have earned the ground they stand on. He would find what was in the mountains. He would come back and tell someone what he found. The road would go where it went, and he would follow it, and whatever came next would be the next thing, and he had long since made his peace with not knowing what it was before it arrived. The sun moved west. The mountains waited. He kept walking. Chapter 61. The Mountains Remember. The Broken Tooth Mountains had not changed. This was, Wei Liang understood as he climbed the familiar switchback trail above the lower foothills, both obviously true and quietly remarkable. Mountains did not change in 5 years. People changed. He had changed so completely that the boy who had scrubbed flagstones in Ash Valley felt, in his memory, like someone he had once met rather than someone he had been. But the rock under his feet was the same rock. The wind through the same gaps in the same ridgelines, the particular gray-green color of the lichen on the north-facing slopes exactly as he remembered it. He did not go to Ash Valley first. He went to the ancient battlefield, 3 days' climb from the village, in a high fold of the mountains where the Bureau's patrols had never bothered to map, because the terrain was too difficult to be commercially interesting. He found it more easily than he expected. His memory of the place had been a child's memory, vague on distances and exact on feelings, but the resonance he had first noticed at 12 years old was still there, deeper and clearer to his current senses than it had ever been. A bell struck somewhere underground, patient, old, waiting. The battlefield itself was a long plateau between 2 peaks, scattered with weathered stone outcroppings that had once, he now understood with his 6th stage sense fully extended, been deliberately placed. Not natural rock formations. A battlefield with structure, with positions, with the residue of large-scale Kai combat pressed into the ground so deeply that 500 years, 1,000 years, however long it had been, had not erased it. He sat at the plateau's center and opened every sense he had. It was different from reading the Iron Mirror Fortress's records or Wan Baikon's hidden arrays. Those had been the work of single minds, coherent and legible. This was the residue of conflict between many minds, layered and contradictory, methods clashing against methods, the ground itself a palimpsest of techniques fighting for the same space. He spent the first day simply listening, the way Shen Guo had once taught him to listen to a single object's voice without being overwhelmed by the surrounding noise. He found, gradually, that he could separate the layers, an older substrate, deep and slow, that felt different from everything above it. Then a middle layer, dense with combat residue, sharp and violent and full of dying. And a top layer, more recent by perhaps a few centuries, faint and deliberate, as though someone had come here after the battle and left something on purpose. He went to the top layer first. Chapter 62. The Note Left for No One. It took him 2 more days to isolate the deliberate layer fully, separating it from the violence beneath it, the way you might separate a single instrument's part from a full orchestra's recording. What he found, once isolated, was not a formation and not a cache. It was closer to a message, a sustained, careful resonance pattern, built to persist for centuries, containing information encoded not in written characters but in the structure of the resonance itself. He recognized the technique immediately, because he had been using a primitive version of it himself for years without a name for it. This was a refined form of the 6th-stage resonant hollow, applied not to read an object's history, but to write into an object's future. Someone, long after this battlefield's violence had ended, had come here specifically because the ground's layered Kai made an excellent medium for a message meant to last, and had spent what felt, from the density of the work, like years embedding something into the stone. He sat with the message and read it slowly, the way he had once read his single water-damaged primer, 4 times over until the words became part of him. It was not the nameless river method. It was older. The message identified itself, in its opening passage, as the testimony of a practitioner from before the founding of the first sects, before the 5-element framework had been formalized as the universal system of cultivation. The practitioner's name had not survived, or had been deliberately omitted. What survived was an account of a war, not between sects, because sects did not yet exist, but between philosophies of Kai. One faction believed Kai should be organized, classified, and channeled through structured systems, ancestors of what would become the 5-element framework. Another faction believed Kai was, in its nature, unstructured, and that organizing it was a convenience that came at the cost of truth. The battlefield beneath him was where those two philosophies had fought their final and most decisive battle. The organizing faction had won. Wei Liang sat with that for a long time, the wind moving across the plateau, the stones holding their 500-year silence around him. The 5-element framework was not a neutral description of reality, the way the Bureau's doctrine implied. It was the surviving side of an ancient argument. The hollow road was not a deviation from the natural order. It was the losing side's philosophy, preserved in fragments by isolated practitioners across centuries, periodically rediscovered and periodically suppressed by an order that had organized itself, in the deepest sense, around having won a war so long ago that its victory had been mistaken for the shape of reality itself. He understood, reading this, why the Bureau's suppression of unstructured methods had always felt to him like something more than commercial protection. It was also, underneath the commerce, an old reflex. A war that the organizing faction had never stopped fighting, even after they had forgotten there had ever been a war. Chapter 63, What the Losing Side Knew. The message continued for several more days of reading, embedded in layers that required different angles of resonance to access, as though the ancient practitioner had built the message in chambers, each one requiring the reader to fully absorb the previous chamber before the next would open. The second chamber described what the unstructured faction had actually believed, beyond simply opposing organization. Their core understanding, the message explained, was that Kai was not fundamentally divisible into 5 elements or any other number. The 5-element framework was useful in the way a map is useful, but it was a map, not the territory. The unstructured faction had practiced something the message called, in archaic characters that took Wei Liang considerable effort to parse, the way of the single current, the understanding that all elemental Kai was a local expression of one undivided flow, and that a sufficiently advanced practitioner could work with the undivided flow directly rather than through its elemental subdivisions. Wei Liang recognized this immediately. It was the primordial flow, 3,000 years before he had channeled it in the Iron Mirror Fortress's central chamber, described by people who had built their entire civilization's cultivation philosophy around it, before they lost the war that decided whether the philosophy would survive. The third chamber explained why they had lost. Not because their philosophy was wrong, because their methods were difficult, slow, and produced power that was hard to predict or control in large-scale conflict. The organizing faction's 5-element framework, whatever its philosophical limitations, had a decisive practical advantage. It was teachable at scale. A sect could train 1,000 disciples in a standardized curriculum and produce 1,000 soldiers with predictable, comparable capabilities. The unstructured faction's way of the single current required each practitioner to find their own relationship with the undivided flow, a process that could not be standardized, could not be mass-produced, and took, on average according to the message's own grim accounting, 3 times longer to reach battlefield-relevant capability. A philosophy that was true but slow had lost to a philosophy that was useful and fast. Wei Liang thought about this for a long time, sitting on the ancient plateau with the wind moving through the gaps in the rocks. He thought about the hollow road's own slowness, the years of patient practice that had no shortcut, the way even his exceptionally fast progress had still taken 4 years of nearly constant work. He thought about the 5-element framework's genuine usefulness, the way it had allowed cultivation knowledge to spread, allowed sects to function, allowed millions of people across centuries to access a structured path toward power that the unstructured methods could never have offered at the same scale. The framework was not simply wrong, he understood. It was a tool that had won because it was a better tool for certain purposes, even though it had also been weaponized into a monopoly that suppressed alternatives for reasons that had nothing to do with its genuine usefulness. Both things were true. The framework was useful, and its monopoly was unjust. He had spent the past year fighting the second without fully understanding the first, and understanding the first now made the fight clearer rather than less necessary. He needed to find a way for both philosophies to coexist, not to replace the 5-element framework with the way of the single current, but to ensure neither one could destroy the other again. Chapter 64, The Fourth Chamber. The fourth chamber of the message was different from the first 3. It was not historical. It was practical, a set of techniques, more developed than anything in the Nameless River method, describing how an advanced practitioner of the way of the single current could deliberately cultivate the undivided flow rather than simply channeling it once, the way Wei Liang had at the Iron Mirror Fortress. The Nameless River method's 9th stage, Wei Liang now understood, was an incomplete fragment of what this older tradition had once known in full. The ancient practitioner who had left the cache, the one whose jade slip had given Wei Liang the complete method, had themselves been working from partial knowledge, reconstructing the way of the single current from fragments that had survived the war's aftermath. When the organizing faction had hunted down and destroyed every adherent they could find. What Wei Liang was reading now was older and more complete than what the cache had given him. It was, as far as he could tell, close to the original source. It described a 10th stage. The Nameless River method ended at 9 stages because the practitioner who compiled it had not known there was a 10th. The ancient message described it plainly, without the dramatic weight that Wei Liang might have expected given everything that came before. The 10th stage was simply the stage at which the practitioner stopped channeling the undivided flow as a visiting current and became, in some partial and permanent sense, an extension of it. Not losing the self, the message was careful to specify. The practitioners who achieved the 10th stage in the old tradition did not dissolve or transcend in the way some later, garbled legends about immortality might suggest. They simply became permanently, structurally connected to the flow in a way that made the boundary between practitioner and Kai a matter of convenience rather than reality. The practical effect, the message said, was a kind of cultivation that required no further input. The 10th stage practitioner did not need to seek Kai, ambient or otherwise, because they were, in the specific technical sense the message used, already continuous with its source. Wei Liang read this section 7 times. He was not ready for it. He knew this with the same clear, unhurried certainty that had guided every major decision of the past 4 years. His 9th stage had cost him a third of his deep channel capacity, even with the vial's preparation. The 10th stage, by the message's own account, required not just prepared channels but a sustained, multi-year process of incremental dissolution and reformation that the message described, with the same archaic precision as everything else, as requiring the practitioner to first fully master and stabilize the 9th stage for no less than a decade. A decade. He was 17. A decade put him at 27, which felt both impossibly distant and, set against the patient logic of the hollow road, entirely reasonable. He closed the resonance, sat back from the stone, and let the plateau's wind move over him while he thought about what he had just learned and what it meant for the years ahead. Chapter 65. Returning to Ash Valley. He went down to Ash Valley on the 8th day, not because the battlefield's lessons were exhausted, but because he had reached a natural pause, and because some part of him, now that he was this close, wanted to see it. The village was smaller than he remembered, which he had expected, having heard the same observation from enough travelers about enough childhood places to know it was a universal experience rather than a personal one. The Y clan hall looked the same, weathered, modest, its courtyard flagstones still bearing the faint discoloration of years of imperfect scrubbing that he recognized with a complicated mixture of feelings. He did not announce himself. He stood at the edge of the village in late afternoon light, his Kai signature at its natural level now, the primordial flows hum present but unthreatening, and let whoever noticed him notice him. Old physician Tan noticed him first. The old physician was sitting in his usual spot, repairing something with the same unhurried competence Wei Liang remembered, and he looked up as though he had been expecting this exact moment for exactly this long. "You came back," Tan said. "I came back," Wei Liang agreed. Tan studied him for a long moment, the particular assessing look of a man who had spent his life around cultivators without being one himself, reading what he could read and accepting the limits of what he could not. "You are different," he said, "not just older. Different in the way the air around you is different." "Yes," Wei Liang said. "I heard things," Tan said. "The contact network reaches even here now since the register became public. People talk about the rootless boy who broke the Bureau's back. I did not connect it to you until the description matched too closely to be coincidence. It is me." Tan was quiet for a moment, and then he smiled, an expression Wei Liang had rarely seen on the old physician's face, brief and genuine. "I always thought there was more to you than the village allowed itself to see," he said. "I am glad I was right." They sat together as the afternoon light shifted toward evening, and Wei Liang told him, in careful and incomplete pieces, what had happened in the years since he had left before dawn with everything he owned in a single pack. Tan listened without interrupting, the way he always had, and when Wei Liang finished, the old physician sat quietly for a while. "Elder Wei died 2 years ago," Tan said eventually. "Wei Peng inherited the clan leadership. He has not been unkind, for what it is worth. I think the years matured him in ways the boy you knew would not have predicted." Wei Liang absorbed this without strong feeling either way. Wei Peng had been a minor cruelty in a childhood with larger problems, and the years had given Wei Liang enough perspective to file the old conflict away as something that no longer required active resolution. "Does the village know what happened?" "With the Bureau, the register, all of it." "Some version of it. The version that travels through gossip rather than careful documentation." Tan's eyes were sharp. "They know a rootless boy from this village did something extraordinary. I think most of them are still working out how to feel about having been wrong about you for so long." Chapter 66. Wei Peng's Apology. Wei Peng found him the next morning at the boulder on the eastern ridge, where Wei Liang had spent so many childhood evenings reading his single damaged book. He had grown into a solid, capable-looking man of 20, with the bearing of someone who had inherited responsibility earlier than he had expected, and had spent 2 years growing into it with more seriousness than his younger self would have predicted. His Kai signature, Wei Liang noted automatically, had settled into a stable mid-Kai gathering configuration, respectable for a minor village clan leader. Unremarkable by the standards of the wider cultivation world Wei Liang now moved through. "I heard you were here," Wei Peng said, stopping a respectful distance away. Tan told me. I'm here, Wai Liang said, not unkindly. Wai Peng was quiet for a moment, visibly working through something he had prepared and was now finding harder to say than he had expected. I was cruel to you, he said finally, when we were children. I have thought about it more in the past 2 years than I did in all the years before, because being responsible for this clan has taught me things about cost and choice that being a privileged child never did. Wai Liang said nothing, waiting. I'm not asking you to forgive it, Wai Peng continued. I am telling you that I see it now for what it was. You had nothing and I had everything, and I made your nothing harder because it amused me and because the village structure rewarded it. I do not think apologizing 5 years later undoes any of that. But I wanted you to hear it, since you came back. Wai Liang sat with this for a moment, looking out at the mountains he had spent so many evenings watching as a child. Thank you for saying it, he said eventually. I'm not carrying the old anger the way you might expect. I have had 5 years and a great deal happening in them to put it in proportion. You were a child being cruel in the way children sometimes are when a system tells them it is acceptable. The system is more at fault than you were, even though you were the hand that did it. That is more generous than I deserve. Maybe, Wai Liang said. Or maybe I have simply learned that holding old grievances costs more than it returns, and I would rather spend my attention on the things ahead of me. Wai Peng nodded slowly. He looked, for a moment, like he wanted to say something else, and then settled on a simpler question instead. What are you doing now? The stories say many things. I do not know which to believe. Wai Liang told him, briefly and without embellishment, about the hollow road, the bureau, the register, the assembly. Wai Peng listened with the specific attention of someone recalibrating his understanding of a person he thought he had fully categorized a long time ago. The clan would be honored, Wai Peng said, when Wai Liang finished, if you would consider Ash Valley a place you could return to. Not as a servant, as whatever you wish to be. Wai Liang looked at him for a long moment and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that the offer touched something genuine in him. I will remember that, he said. Thank you. Chapter 67, Letters Across the Network. He stayed in Ash Valley for 5 days, longer than he had planned, in part because the village's particular quality of slow time was a rest he had not realized he needed, and in part because old physician Tan's company turned out to be exactly as good as Wai Liang remembered, sharpened now by the freedom to speak plainly about things that had once required careful indirection. On the 3rd day, a letter reached him through the Contact Network's local node, the same weathered traveler system that had once carried Wai Ru's letters across the mountains. This one was from Yu King. Wai Liang, the organization has a name now, the Open Channel Compact, deliberately not a sect. We are registering it with the Oversight Committee as a recognized cultivation resource and advocacy body, which gives us standing to participate in future reviews without requiring sect affiliation. Master Wen has agreed to second 2 Verdant Canopy Information disciples to the Compact for an initial year, which gives us institutional capacity without institutional control. Elder Hu is formally joining as the Western liaison. The Contact Network is folding into the Compact structure as its field operations arm, with full continuity of the existing relationships. 3 more suppressed lineages have come forward in the past 2 weeks, encouraged by Song Fei's account. We are documenting each one and submitting reclassification requests to the committee. Elder Fang Liuking has invited a formal delegation to visit the Drifting Pine sect to study the relationship between the Mountain Quiet Method and the Hollow Road. I have accepted on the Compact's behalf and would like you present if your travels allow it within the next 2 months. How was the mountain? I assume you found something, since you have not written, and you only go silent when you are deep in something that requires your full attention. Yu King, Wai Liang read it twice, smiling slightly at the last line's accuracy, and wrote his reply that evening, sitting at Tan's small table by lamplight. "You king, I found the source. Before the five-element framework, before the sex, there was a war between two philosophies of Kai, and the one that won became the foundation of everything the Bureau built its monopoly upon. The hollow road is a fragment of the losing side's knowledge, preserved by accident through people desperate enough to need it. There is a 10th stage. I am not ready for it. I may not be ready for a decade. I am, for the first time in years, content to wait, because the waiting now has a clear shape rather than being simply the absence of options. The open channel compact sounds exactly right. You have built precisely what was needed, and I am not surprised, though I remain glad. I will come to the Drifting Pine sect. Elder Fang and I have an unfinished conversation, and I think what I learned on the mountain will matter to it. Ash Valley is smaller than I remembered, and why Peng apologized for the boy he used to be. I find I have already forgiven him, which surprised me less than it might have. Why Liang he sent it the next morning and felt, watching the traveler carry it down the mountain road, the particular satisfaction of a life that had, against every early expectation, become full of people worth writing to. Chapter 68, The Boulder, Revisited. On his final evening in Ash Valley, Wai Liang climbed to the eastern ridge boulder one more time alone, as the sun set over the Broken Tooth Mountains in the same slow orange burn he remembered from 100 childhood evenings. He sat where he had always sat, in the worn hollow his younger self had pressed into the stone through years of repeated visits, and he let himself simply be still for a while, the way he had been still as a 12-year-old with one damaged book, and no future the village could see for him. He thought about the boy who had sat here reading a forbidden passage 4 times in a row, deciding that the word offense implied a choice he did not have. He thought about how right that boy had been, and how much he had not yet understood about what the choice would cost and what it would build. He took the original primer from his pack. He still carried it, water-stained and fragile, the missing first 20 pages still missing, the surviving pages now reinforced with careful patches Shen Guo had taught him to apply. It was, by any practical measure, obsolete. He had the complete nameless river method memorized in full, had read the ancient battlefield's deeper testimony, had access to libraries and lineages, and a growing network of practitioners more knowledgeable than the primer's anonymous compiler had ever been. He kept it anyway. Some things were not about practical use. He opened it to the passage he had read so many times as a child. The water-stained ink had faded further in 5 years, but he had the words by heart and did not need to strain to read them. The most desperate seekers sometimes found paths hidden even from the heavens. These methods are invariably dangerous, invariably forbidden, and invariably destroyed whenever the great sects discover them. It was no longer entirely true. The methods were no longer invariably destroyed. He had spent 4 years, and a great deal of risk ensuring that the word invariably no longer applied, and the oversight committee's continued existence, however imperfect, was the evidence. He closed the book and looked out at the mountains, the same sky, the same patient indifference of the world to the small dramas of any single life within it. He was not the same person who had sat here 5 years ago, but something in him, the particular quality of stillness that the hollow road had found in him before he had a name for what it was, remained constant across every change. He thought that quality might be the truest thing about him, more fundamental than any stage or technique, the actual root from which everything else had grown. Rootless, the testing stone had said. Nothing, not a flicker. He almost laughed, sitting there in the last orange light. The stone had been measuring for a kind of root it understood. It had never been equipped to measure the kind he actually had. Chapter 69, South toward the Drifting Pine. He left Ash Valley at dawn, with Tan's blessing and a small parcel of dried herbs the old physician insisted on packing for him, the same practical kindness Tan had always shown without ever making it feel like charity. Wei Peng saw him to the village gate, and the two of them stood for a moment in a silence that had, over 5 days, become comfortable rather than strained. "Will you come back again?" Wei Peng asked. "Probably," Wei Liang said, and found that he meant it. "The road tends to circle back to where it started eventually. I think that might be part of its nature." He walked south, retracing the long road toward the prefectural capital, and then beyond it, toward the western ranges where the drifting pine sect kept its mountain halls. The journey took 3 weeks, and he spent much of it in the particular quiet productivity that long solo travel had taught him, reviewing the ancient battlefield's testimony in his memory, working through the implications of the 10th stage's requirements, occasionally stopping at contact networkway stations to exchange information, and, increasingly often now, to meet other practitioners who had heard about the Hollow Road and wanted to understand it. This was new. In the years of hiding, he had been alone with his practice by necessity. Now, with the register public and the bureau's monopoly cracked, a slow trickle of curious, hopeful, occasionally desperate practitioners had begun seeking him out through the network. People whose spirit roots were weak or absent or simply unconventional. People who had heard that there might, after all, be a road for them. He could not teach all of them. The Hollow Road's patient, individual nature meant it resisted mass instruction in the same way the ancient message had described the way of the single current resisting it 3,000 years ago. But he could point them toward Song Fei's reopened school, toward Shen Guo's inn, toward the growing library of recovered and reclassified methods that the Open Channel Compact was assembling. He could, increasingly, simply be a living demonstration that the road existed, which turned out to matter more than any single lesson he could offer. A young woman at a way station 3 days from the drifting pine territory, perhaps 14, with no detectable spirit root, and the particular flat resignation in her eyes that Wei Liang recognized immediately because he had once worn the same expression, asked him the question he was beginning to hear often. "Is it true? That someone like me could still cultivate it is true," he said. "It is also true that it will be harder than anything the sects teach, and slower, and you will have to want it more than you have ever wanted anything, because there will be no shortcuts and no teacher who can do the work for you." She considered this with a seriousness that belied her age. "I want it," she said. He gave her the name of Song Fei's school and the location, and a small jade token marked with the inverted mountain sign that would let her travel the sign network safely, and watched her walk away toward the south with her shoulders set in the particular determined line of someone who had just been handed, for the first time, a future she had been told did not exist. Chapter 70. The Drifting Pine Sect. The Drifting Pine Sect's mountain halls were carved into a series of interconnected peaks in the western ranges, weathered gray stone buildings that had clearly been designed, centuries ago, by people who valued stillness and proportion over grandeur. Wei Liang arrived in the late afternoon, his Kai signature at its natural open level, and was met at the outer gate by a disciple who, upon registering the particular hum of the primordial flow, bowed with a formality that suggested instructions had been given well in advance of his arrival. Elder Fang Liuqing met him personally in the sect's central courtyard, where Yu King was already waiting, having arrived 2 days earlier to begin the compact's formal documentation process. She looked, Wei Liang noted with the particular attention he had developed for reading her over the past year, well, settled into the new work in a way that suited her precise, structural mind. "You found something on the mountain," she said, by way of greeting, before he had even fully crossed the courtyard. "I can feel it in how you're carrying yourself. I found the source, he said, or close to it. I'll tell you everything tonight. Elder Fang studied him with the particular attentiveness of a practitioner whose own method shared deep roots with his. You carry something new since we last spoke, she said. Heavier, but settled. Like a question that has found at least the shape of its answer, even if not the answer itself. That is exactly right, Wei Liang said, surprised by her precision. 300 years of still cultivation teaches you to read what sits underneath a person's stillness, she said, with something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Come. I have arranged a meeting hall and gathered our senior practitioners of the Mountain Quiet method. They have been waiting eagerly to hear what the Hollow Road's most accomplished living practitioner has to teach us about the principle their own tradition has spent 3 centuries circling without quite naming. Wei Liang felt the weight of that framing, accomplished, living teacher, and understood that some part of the road ahead would now always carry this shape. Not the solitary boy on the mountain anymore, but a person other practitioners, other traditions, looked to for answers. It was not a role he had sought. It had arrived anyway, the way the stages had arrived, through necessity and the patient logic of the road revealing itself one step at a time. He thought of the 14-year-old girl at the way station, walking south toward a future she had been told did not exist. He thought of Wai Ru's letters, of Director Kang's careful, costly choice of Song Fei's carved walls and reopened school, of Yu King building something genuinely new out of the wreckage of what had tried to destroy her, of Shen Guo's scarred hand and patient decades of keeping. The road had never been his alone. It had only felt that way because, for the first 4 years, he had been the only one walking it. I am ready, he said, and followed Elder Fang into the meeting hall with Yu King falling into step beside him, and the western mountains catching the last gold light of the day outside the windows, patient and vast, and entirely unconcerned with how small or large any single life appeared against them, which Wei Liang had come, slowly and through hard practice, to find less lonely than he once had. Chapter 71. The Meeting Hall. The Drifting Pine Sect's senior practitioners of the Mountain Quiet method numbered 11, gathered in a circular hall whose architecture, Wei Liang noted upon entering, was itself a kind of teaching. No head seat, no hierarchy expressed in the furniture, every position equidistant from the center where a simple stone basin held water so still it looked solid. Elder Fang introduced him without embellishment. This is Wei Liang, of the Hollow Road. He has agreed to share what he has learned, and to learn from what we have built across 3 centuries. I ask that we extend him the same respect we would extend any senior practitioner of an allied tradition. The 11 practitioners studied him with expressions that ranged from open curiosity to careful reserve. He understood the reserve. He was 17, younger than most of their disciples, and he carried himself with a stillness that did not match his apparent age, which experienced cultivators generally found either impressive or faintly unsettling, depending on their temperament. Before we begin, Wei Liang said, I want to be honest about what I am offering and what I am not. I do not have 300 years of refined practice behind me. I have 4 years of necessity-driven discovery, much of it improvised under pressure, validated more by survival than by careful method. What I have that may be useful to you is recent and specific, a direct experience of the primordial flow, and an ancient testimony I found that explains where both our traditions actually come from. One of the senior practitioners, an older man named Bao Hang, whose Kai carried the particular settled depth Wei Liang associated with decades of patient cultivation, spoke first. Tell us about the testimony. Wei Liang told them, the war before the sects, the organizing faction and the unstructured faction, the decisive battle in the Broken Tooth Mountains, the way of the single current, slower and truer, defeated by a framework that was faster and more teachable at scale. The hall was very quiet when he finished. 300 years, Elder Fang said slowly. We have taught the mountain quiet method as an approved variation of the earth root curriculum, never understanding why it felt, at its deepest levels, like it was reaching for something the curriculum did not name. You are telling us we were reaching for the thing the curriculum was built to replace. Yes, Wei Liang said. Bao Hang's expression had gone very still, the particular stillness of someone absorbing something that reorganized decades of accumulated understanding. Show us, he said, not tell. Show us what you mean by the primordial flow. We have circled it for 3 centuries. I would like to know before I die whether what I have spent my life reaching for is real. Chapter 72, a demonstration, carefully made. Wei Liang considered the request seriously before answering, because the honest answer required nuance that a quick yes would have flattened. I can let you feel its residue, he said. The flow moves through me constantly now, at a natural, low level, since the Iron Mirror Fortress. I do not need to channel a fresh surge to give you something real to sense. That would be safer for everyone in this hall, and more honest besides, since the residue is what I actually live with day to day, rather than the dramatic surge you might be imagining. That is acceptable, Bo Hang said, and the other 10 practitioners settled into the particular receptive stillness that Wei Liang recognized from his own practice, a readiness to sense rather than to act. He opened the hollow, not widely, just enough to let the hum beneath his channels become perceptible at the hall's scale, and held it there, steady, while 11 mountain quiet practitioners closed their eyes and reached toward it with 3 centuries of refined sensitivity. The reactions, when they came, were varied and quiet. One younger practitioner, perhaps in her 30s, made a small, involuntary sound, something between a gasp and a laugh, and pressed a hand to her chest. Another sat utterly motionless, tears slipping down an unmoving face. Bao Hang himself simply breathed, slow and deep, his expression the specific blend of grief and recognition that Wei Liang had come to associate with people encountering, for the first time, evidence that something they had devoted their life to was not a beautiful illusion. It is the same thing, Bo Hang said eventually, his voice rough. The center of every meditation I have ever taught. The thing underneath the stillness that the stillness was always pointing toward. I have felt the edge of it perhaps a dozen times in 60 years of practice, in moments so brief I questioned whether I had imagined them. He opened his eyes and looked at Wei Liang with an expression that held no reserve at all now. You carry it permanently. Yes, Wei Liang said. At a cost. My channels are altered. Roughly a third of my deep capacity was consumed in the process of becoming permanently connected to it. A third, Bao Hang repeated, and what remains is wider and smoother than what was lost, Wei Liang said. The flow scours and rebuilds as it passes. I am, by most measures, more capable now than before, despite the loss. But the loss was real, and I want you to understand that clearly before any of you consider walking toward what I am describing. This is not a power with no price. The younger practitioner who had gasped, a woman named Liu Zion, wiped her face with the back of her hand and asked, with the directness of someone still processing something large, could the mountain quiet method reach it? On its own terms, without becoming the hollow road. Wei Liang thought about this carefully, drawing on what he had learned from the ancient battlefield's testimony. I believe so, he said. The ancient message described many practitioners reaching the way of the single current through different specific practices, all converging on the same underlying principle. Your method has spent 3 centuries developing tools mine never needed: group resonance, sustained collective stillness, techniques for stability that come from a tradition with the luxury of an unbroken lineage. I think your road to the same destination would look different from mine, and might, in some respects, be safer for it. Elder Fang was watching this exchange with the focused attention of a strategist watching a plan take shape faster than she had anticipated. "Then we have work to do," she said. "Real work, not theoretical comparison." Chapter 73, Yu King's Documentation. While Wei Liang worked through the technical comparison with the mountain quiet practitioners over the following days, Yu King pursued a parallel project that was, in its own way, equally significant, building the formal documentation structure that would let the Oversight Committee evaluate and reclassify the mountain quiet method's relationship to its 3-century-old approved status. This was, she explained to Wei Liang over a quiet dinner on the 4th evening, exactly the kind of precedent the Open Channel Compact needed. "The mountain quiet method has never been suppressed," she said, laying out her notes on the table between them with her characteristic precision. "It has been here, openly practiced, approved, for 300 years. If we can document that it converges on the same underlying principle as the hollow road, which the committee has already acknowledged through the unbound array theory's reclassification, then we establish something important, that the 5-element framework and the primordial flow are not opposing systems to be chosen between, but different depths of the same reality. Which makes the Bureau's old monopoly look less like safety enforcement and more like what it always was," Wei Liang said. "Exactly. An approved method and a suppressed method, both reaching for the same deep truth, treated completely differently for reasons that had nothing to do with their actual content." She tapped her notes. "This is the argument that will matter most to the conservative sects, the ones who supported the Bureau not out of malice but out of genuine belief in the 5-element framework's primacy. We are not asking them to abandon their framework. We are showing them it was never the whole picture, using a method they themselves have approved and trusted for centuries." Wei Liang considered this. "You are building the argument that will convince the people who are not yet convinced." "I am building the argument that will convince the people who matter most for what comes next," she said. "The radicals are already with us. The reactionaries will never come around regardless of evidence. The people in between, the cautious, institutionally minded majority who supported the Bureau, because it seemed reasonable rather than because they hated alternative methods, they are the ones who decide whether what we have built lasts beyond this generation." He looked at her for a moment. The precise, patient strategist she had become from the desperate, burned information disciple he had found in a ruined watchtower felt, in this moment, like the clearest demonstration of everything the past year had built. "You have changed as much as I have," he said. "Maybe more." She looked up from her notes, something passing across her face that was not quite surprise but adjacent to it. "I do not think about it often," she said. "There has not been time. But yes, I am not the disciple who memorized a register and ran. I am building something now instead of only documenting what others destroyed." "Building suits you," he said. "It does," she agreed, and the quiet satisfaction in her voice was, Wei Liang thought, one of the better things the past year had produced. Chapter 74, Liu Xian's Question. Liu Xian sought him out on the 6th day, finding him in the sect's eastern garden where he had taken to spending early mornings in quiet practice before the day's formal sessions began. He had learned over the preceding days, the mountain quiet method's most promising practitioner under 50, already at a cultivation depth that her sect siblings spoke of with a mixture of pride and quiet competitive frustration. She sat on the garden's low wall without asking permission, which Wei Liang had come to recognize, among drifting pine practitioners, as a sign of comfort rather than presumption. "I want to ask you something I have not asked in front of the elders," she said. He waited. "When you channeled the flow at the Iron Mirror Fortress," she said, "were you afraid?" He thought about the question honestly, the way he tried to think about every question that mattered. Less than I expected to be, he said. I had spent 4 years walking a road with no guarantees at any step. By the time I reached that chamber, fear had become a familiar companion rather than an obstacle. I noticed it, and I walked forward anyway, because walking forward had become simply what I did. That is not quite an answer to whether you were afraid. He smiled slightly, recognizing the precision of the follow-up. Yes, he admitted. I was afraid. I simply did not let the fear decide what I did next. Liu Ziyan nodded slowly, processing this with the same careful seriousness she had shown in the meeting hall. I think I am close, she said. Closer than the elders realize, perhaps closer than I have told them. The past 6 days of working with you, feeling what you carry, it has shown me something about my own practice that I did not have language for before. I think if I push further, I might reach the edge of what you reached. That is a significant claim, Wei Liang said carefully. I know. I am not making it lightly. She looked at him directly. I want to ask you to be present if I attempt it. Not to guide me, your method and mine are different enough that guidance might do more harm than good. But to be there, in case something goes wrong that needs your particular kind of help. Wei Liang sat with this request for a long moment, weighing what he knew against what he did not. I will speak with Elder Fang and Bo Hang first, he said. Not to ask permission for you. That is not mine to give or withhold. But because if you attempt this, it should be done with the full knowledge and support of your own tradition's senior practitioners, not as something separate from them. That is fair, Liu Ziyan said, and something in her posture eased slightly, as though she had expected him to either refuse outright or agree without the necessary caution, and his actual answer, careful and considered, had reassured her more than either extreme would have. Why now, he asked. You said you have been close. Why choose this week to consider pushing further? She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the garden's careful arrangement of stone and water. Because for 300 years, she said, every practitioner of my tradition who got close to this edge assumed they were imagining it, or experiencing some minor deviation that needed correcting back toward the standard method. You arrived and told us it was real. That changes what it means to reach for it. I am not risking my cultivation chasing a hallucination anymore. I am attempting something that you have proven is actually there. Chapter 75. Bo Hang's Blessing. Elder Fang and Bo Hang received the request with more gravity than Wei Liang had anticipated, though in retrospect he understood why. Liu Ziyan was not simply a talented disciple, but the specific practitioner that the sect's leadership had quietly identified, years earlier, as the most likely candidate to eventually lead the Mountain Quiet method into its next generation. What she was proposing was not a minor experiment. It was a decision that would shape the tradition's future regardless of outcome. She has spoken of this before, Bo Hang said when the four of them, Wei Liang, Yu King, Elder Fang, and Bo Hang, gathered in a private chamber to discuss the request. Carefully, indirectly, the way a disciple tests whether an idea will be received before stating it fully. I did not realize how close she believed herself to be. What is your assessment? Elder Fang asked him directly. You have trained her longer than anyone. Bo Hang was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face working through something that looked like a mixture of pride and fear in roughly equal measure. She is the most naturally gifted practitioner I have trained in 40 years, he said. If anyone in this generation is positioned to reach what Wei Liang reached, it is her. But the hollow road's price, as he has described it honestly to us, is real. A third of deep channel capacity in his case, with the benefit of significant prior preparation through the black vial he described. Liu Ziyan has no equivalent preparation. The ancient testimony Wei Liang found suggested different traditions might reach the single current through different specific costs. Yu King said, consulting her notes. It is possible the mountain quiet method's 3 centuries of stability-focused practice provide a different kind of preparation, one that does not map directly onto the hollow road's vial-based approach. Possible? Wai Liang agreed. Not certain. This is the honest limit of what any of us currently know. Bo Hang looked at Wai Liang for a long moment. You channeled the full flow at 16 in a single sustained event, in circumstances of considerable danger and pressure. Liu Zion is proposing something gentler, an attempt to reach the edge in a controlled setting, with you present specifically to help if something goes wrong. Does that difference matter in your judgment? I believe it matters significantly, Wai Liang said, and in her favor. A controlled, supported attempt, with someone present who has already survived the full channeling and understands its texture, is considerably safer than what I did, which was improvised entirely alone in a moment that could not be repeated or undone if it had gone wrong. Elder Fang and Bao Hang exchanged a long look, the particular wordless communication of 2 people who had led a tradition together for decades. Then we give our blessing, Elder Fang said, carefully, with every safeguard available to us. Liu Zion has earned the right to attempt this, and our tradition has waited 300 years for someone capable of attempting it. We will not let fear cost us the chance simply, because the chance is also frightening. Chapter 76, The Attempt. They prepared for 9 days before the attempt itself, a deliberate pace that Wai Liang insisted upon over Liu Zion's quiet eagerness to move faster. The hollow road taught me that haste is the road's only true enemy, he told her on the 3rd day of preparation, as they worked through a careful mapping of her channel structure that he conducted using his 6th-stage sense, identifying every point where her decades of mountain quiet practice had built strength, and every point where it had left gaps that an uncontrolled surge of the single current might exploit. 9 days is not excessive caution. It is the minimum respect the attempt deserves. She accepted this with the same seriousness she brought to everything, and used the 9 days well, deepening her meditation, working with Bao Hang on stability techniques refined over his 60 years of practice, and spending 2 full days in silent retreat that even Wai Liang's resonant sense respected as private. The attempt itself took place in the same circular meeting hall where Wai Liang had first met the sect's senior practitioners. The still water basin at its center now drained and replaced with a simple meditation cushion. 11 senior practitioners formed an outer ring, their combined stillness creating a field of supportive resonance that Wai Liang recognized with some admiration as a genuinely effective technique he had never needed because he had always practiced alone. Liu Zion sat at the center. Wai Liang sat 3 feet from her, close enough to intervene immediately if something went wrong, far enough to avoid interfering with her own building resonance. She began as she had practiced, settling into the deep stillness the mountain quiet method was built around. The particular quality that Wai Liang now understood was the tradition's 3-century-old approach to the hollow he had found through entirely different necessity. He watched her Kai signature with his full sense extended, ready to act. For a long time, nothing visibly changed. The hall was silent except for the 11 practitioners' synchronized breathing, slow and deep, building a collective field of resonance around Liu Zion's solitary effort. Then, gradually, Wai Liang felt it, the same quality he had felt in the Iron Mirror Fortress's central chamber. Faint here, distant, but unmistakably the same current beginning to respond to Liu Zion's reaching stillness. Not pouring through her the way it had poured through him in the chamber's concentrated environment. There was no equivalent concentration here to draw from, but touching her, briefly, the way a hand might brush the surface of water without breaking through it. Liu Zion's breath caught. Her whole body went rigid for a moment, and Wai Liang tensed, ready to intervene. But then her breathing resumed deeper, and something in her expression, eyes still closed, shifted into an openness he recognized from his own first contact with the flow. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then it receded gently the way it had receded for the ancient founder whose account Song Fei had preserved. Liu Zian opened her eyes. She was crying silently without distress. "I felt it," she said. "It is real. It is real." Chapter 77, What the Attempt Proved. The aftermath assessment which Wei Liang conducted carefully over the following hour while Liu Zian rested under Bo Hang's watchful attention revealed something significant. Her channels showed minimal damage, nothing like the third capacity loss Wei Liang had sustained at the Iron Mirror Fortress. The brevity protected her. He explained to the assembled elders that evening, once Liu Zian had been confirmed stable and resting comfortably. 30 seconds of light contact, supported by 11 practitioners' collective resonance, is a fundamentally different event from sustained, solitary, full-volume channeling in a chamber specifically designed to concentrate 5 centuries of constrained Kai. She touched the edge. I walked fully through the door. The costs were never going to be comparable. Then the mountain quiet method's path to the single current is genuinely safer, Elder Fang said, something like vindication in her voice after 3 centuries of her tradition's quiet, patient uncertainty. Safer for this specific kind of brief contact. Yes, Wei Liang said, careful as always not to overstate his confidence. Whether a sustained, full channeling through your method would carry the same proportional safety, I genuinely do not know. That would require its own careful, gradual testing, the same patient approach we used tonight, scaled up slowly rather than attempted all at once. Bao Hang, who had barely left Liu Zian's side since the attempt concluded, looked up at this. "A gradual path," he said slowly. "Not a single decisive breakthrough, but a deepening practice across years. Each step tested and confirmed safe before the next is attempted. That is, I believe, closer to what the ancient testimony actually described as the original tradition's intended approach," Wei Liang said. "My own path was an aberration, forced by necessity and circumstance into something faster and more dangerous than the way of the single current was ever meant to be walked. What Liu Zian did tonight, and what your tradition could continue to develop, may actually be closer to the authentic original method than my own." This observation settled into the room with a particular weight. Yu King, who had been documenting the entire attempt with her characteristic thoroughness, looked up from her notes. "This matters enormously for the compact's work," she said. "If the mountain quiet method offers a safer, more gradual path to the same destination, then we are not just documenting a historical curiosity. We are potentially offering the wider cultivation world an alternative route to the primordial flow that does not require the kind of desperate, solitary, high-risk path Wei Liang was forced into. A path that could be taught, gradually, safely, to anyone with sufficient patience and the right foundational practice, including practitioners with conventional spirit roots," Elder Fang said slowly, the full implications visibly assembling themselves in her mind. Not just the rootless. Anyone willing to walk a patient, 300-year proven road toward something deeper than the 5-element framework alone offers. Wei Liang felt something settle in his chest at this. A quiet, significant satisfaction that was different from the sharper triumph of the Iron Mirror Fortress. That had been a door broken open by force at considerable cost. This, a gradual, gentle, collectively supported path discovered through patient collaboration, felt like the beginning of the door becoming, simply, a door that anyone could walk through. Chapter 78, A Letter from Song Fei. A letter arrived from Song Fei 11 days into Wei Liang's stay at the Drifting Pine sect, carried by the Contact Network's Western Relay, with the particular care reserved for important correspondence. Wei Liang, The Resonant Mountain School now has 43 students, more than I expected this early, and more than I am entirely prepared to teach alone, though 2 of my early arrivals have shown enough aptitude and dedication that I am training them as junior instructors, which has eased the burden considerably. The school is, I confess, not quite what my ancestors' original institution was. We teach the stone and voice method as our foundation, as he did, but I have begun incorporating elements I learned from watching you and you, King, these past months, particularly around the patient, individualized attention that the hollow road demands, and that I think any genuine cultivation teaching benefits from, regardless of the specific method involved. The walls with the carved names, the ones the 2 surviving students left 200 years ago, are now the school's central hall. Every new student spends their first week simply living among those names before any formal instruction begins. I want them to understand, before they learn a single technique, what was lost and why their presence here matters. 3 of my students are rootless. I want you to know this specifically, because I think you will understand its weight better than anyone else I could tell. They came because they heard a rootless boy from a mountain village broke the Bureau's monopoly, and they wanted to know if the same road might be open to them. I am teaching them what I can of the stone and voice foundations, though I have told them honestly that the deeper road, the one you walked, requires a teacher with direct experience I do not have. I am hoping you might visit when your work at the Drifting Pine concludes and meet them. I am, for the first time in 50 years of keeping, simply happy. I wanted you to know that, since you are part of the reason it became possible. Song Fei Y Liang read the letter twice, sitting alone in the garden where Liu Zion had first asked him about fear, and felt the particular weight of it settle into him. He showed it to Yu King that evening. She read it carefully, and when she finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was thinking something through rather than simply pausing. "You should go," she said. "Not eventually. Soon." The work here with the Drifting Pine practitioners is well underway. Elder Fang and Bo Hang have what they need to continue developing Liu Zion's gradual path, without requiring your constant presence. And I can manage the compact's documentation from here for several weeks. 3 rootless students, Y Liang said, waiting to know if the road is real. Yes, Yu King said simply. Go tell them. Chapter 79, Farewell to the Drifting Pine. He left the Drifting Pine sect 2 days later, having spent the intervening time ensuring the comparative documentation between the 2 traditions was thorough enough to stand on its own, and having one final, significant conversation with Bo Hang in the garden at dawn. I have trained disciples for 40 years, Bo Hang said, always within the bounds of what I understood the mountain quiet method to be capable of. You have shown me, in 11 days, that those bounds were narrower than the truth. I do not know whether to be grateful or grieved by the years I might have spent reaching further, had I understood sooner. Be grateful, Y Liang said. Grief over a closed door is reasonable, but you have spent 40 years building something that turned out to be more than you knew, which is a better discovery than spending 40 years building something that turned out to be less. The mountain quiet method was never wrong. It was simply deeper than its own practitioners fully understood, which I think may be true of every genuine cultivation tradition, including mine. Bo Hang considered this with the particular gravity he brought to everything. You speak with unusual wisdom for someone so young. I have had an unusual 4 years, Y Liang said, and Bo Hang laughed, a real laugh, brief and genuine, the first Y Liang had heard from him. Elder Fang saw him off at the sect's outer gate, where Yu King was also waiting, having decided to accompany him partway south before continuing on to a separate compact meeting in the prefectural capital. The committee will want a full report on Liu Zion's attempt, Elder Fang said. I will prepare it carefully, with full attention to both the promise and the genuine risk, exactly as you modeled for us. We will not repeat the Bureau's old habit of either suppressing inconvenient truths or overselling convenient ones. That is exactly right, Wei Liang said. Thank you for trusting an outsider with something this significant to your tradition. You are not quite an outsider anymore, Elder Fang said. 3 centuries of mountain quiet practice and 4 years of hollow road necessity have turned out to be cousins who never knew each other's names. That makes you something closer to family than guest, whether either of us expected that when you first walked through our gate. Wei Liang felt the weight and warmth of that statement settle into him as he and Yu King walked south down the mountain road, the drifting pine-sex gray halls receding behind them into the morning mist. You're thinking about the 3 rootless students, Yu King said, after they had walked in comfortable silence for an hour. I am thinking about all of it, he said. The students, Liu Zion's gradual path, the 10th stage waiting a decade ahead of me, the Oversight Committee's slow, necessary work, Director Kang reconsidering her whole career, Wei Peng's apology, Wei Ru's letters. 5 years ago I was scrubbing flagstones and being told plainly and repeatedly that I had no future worth considering. Now I am walking south to tell 3 children that the future the world denied them might, after all, exist. Yu King was quiet for a moment. Does it feel like enough? She asked. After everything. He thought about this honestly, the way he tried to think about everything that mattered. No, he said. There is too much still broken, too many names in that register whose lineages may never be fully recovered, too much of the Bureau's old structure still standing even in its weakened form. But it feels like a real beginning, rather than a closed door pretending to be the whole of the world. That is more than I had any right to expect. 5 years ago, Chapter 80, south toward the school. They parted ways at a crossroads 3 days south of the drifting pine sect. Yu King, continuing east toward the prefectural capital, and the compact's growing administrative needs. Wei Liang continuing south toward the resonant mountain school, and the 3 rootless students waiting to learn whether their road was real. Send word when you arrive, Yu King said at the crossroads, in the particular tone that had become, over the past year, their version of an embrace neither of them had quite found the right moment to make literal. And when the 10th stage's decade is closer to its end, I intend to be present for that, whatever it requires of either of us. I will, he said. Build well while I am gone. The compact, the documentation, all of it. I have complete confidence you will. I know you do, she said, with the particular dry warmth that had become, over months of shared danger and shared building, entirely her own. That is, I have come to understand, one of the things I value most about you. They stood for a moment longer at the crossroads, the kind of pause that held more than either of them said aloud. And then she turned east and he turned south, and the road carried them, as roads do, toward the separate and converging shapes of what came next. The journey south took 9 days, through country that grew gradually warmer and greener as he descended from the western ranges toward the southern foothills, where Song Fei's reopened school now stood. He spent the days in the particular productive solitude that long travel had taught him, reviewing everything the drifting pine sect had taught him about gradual, supported paths to the single current, turning it over against his own knowledge of the 10th stage's requirements, beginning to sketch, in his mind, what a careful decade of preparation might actually look like. He arrived at the old school building on a warm afternoon, the same building where he had once stood reading 200 years of carved names on stone walls and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what had been lost. It looked different now. The roof repaired, the courtyard swept, voices audible from within, the specific, particular sound of a place that had come back to life after 2 centuries of silence. Song Fei met him at the gate, looking, as her letter had promised, simply happy in a way that suited her weathered, patient face. "They have been asking about you every day since my letter went out," she said. "I told them you would come when you could, not before. I am glad you could arrive this soon." She led him through the courtyard, past students in training poses that mixed her stone and voice fundamentals with subtler influences he recognized as her recent learning from watching him and Yu King, toward the central hall where the carved names still covered every wall, where 3 young students sat waiting with the particular tense hope of people who had traveled a long way on the strength of a story they were not yet certain was true. Wei Liang looked at them, 3 faces, 3 different kinds of nervous hope, and felt the full circle of the past 5 years settle into a shape he recognized. A boy on a boulder, reading a forbidden passage 4 times over, deciding that offense implied a choice he did not have. He had been right. The choice had simply never been the one the world told him he had. "My name is Wei Liang," he said, crossing the threshold into the hall of carved names, the afternoon light falling warm across 2 centuries of memory and 3 children's waiting futures. "I was born without a spirit root, in a village smaller than this one, and I was told, plainly and often, that there was no road for me. I am here to tell you that the people who told me that were wrong, and that I intend to spend the rest of my life proving exactly how wrong they were, alongside anyone willing to walk the road with me." He sat down across from them, the carved names watching from every wall, and began, patiently, to teach. Pater 81, 3 students. Their names were Chen Wei, a serious boy of 13 with a farmer's calloused hands and a stillness about him that Wei Liang recognized immediately. Mei, 11, the youngest, whose eyes carried a particular wariness that spoke of a childhood spent being told what she was not. And Tang Jun, 15, who had walked 200 li alone after hearing the story of the rootless boy who broke the bureau, carrying nothing but a single change of clothes and a stubbornness Wei Liang found immediately familiar. "The first thing I need you to understand," Wei Liang told them, sitting cross-legged on the floor of the hall of carved names with the 3 of them arranged in a loose circle around him, "is that I cannot give you power. No one can. The hollow road is not a gift that passes from teacher to student the way a sect technique might. It is a discovery that each of you will have to make yourselves with guidance, but never with shortcuts." Mei's face fell slightly, the particular disappointment of a child who had hoped, despite everything, for something easier than what was being described. "I know that is not what you wanted to hear," Wei Liang said gently. "I wanted an easier answer, too, when I was your age, scrubbing courtyard stones in a village that told me I had no future. There was no easier answer for me. I do not think there will be one for you. But I can tell you with complete honesty that the difficult answer is real. That is more than I had when I started." Chen Wei, who had been quiet and watchful since Wei Liang arrived, spoke first. "How do we begin with stillness?" Wei Liang said. "Not the stillness of sitting quietly, though that is part of it. The deeper stillness of stopping the habit of reaching for things you have been told you cannot have, and instead learning to simply be present, open, and patient, the way a hollow space is patient for whatever might eventually move through it." He spent the rest of the afternoon teaching them the first lesson, the same lesson he had taught himself by necessity on a boulder in the Broken Tooth Mountains 5 years ago: how to sit in genuine internal quiet, without forcing, without straining, simply present and open. It was, he discovered, much harder to teach than it had been to learn alone. Alone, he had needed only to find his own way through trial and failure, answerable to no one but himself. Teaching required him to watch 3 different bodies, 3 different temperaments, and adjust his guidance to each one's particular obstacles. Mei's tendency to clench against disappointment before it could even arrive, Tang Jun's restless impatience that fought against the very stillness he needed to cultivate, Chen Wei's natural aptitude that came with its own danger of complacency. By evening, none of them had felt anything resembling what Wei Liang had described. This did not surprise him. It had taken him months of solitary practice before his first faint thread of awareness on the testing stone's cool surface. "This is normal," he told them as the day's light faded. "Do not measure your first week against my years. Measure only whether you are still willing to try tomorrow." All three nodded with varying degrees of conviction. Wei Liang thought, watching them, that he recognized the particular mixture of hope and doubt on each face because he had once worn the same expression himself, on a different mountain, a lifetime ago. Chapter 82: The Patience of Teaching. The weeks that followed taught Wei Liang something he had not anticipated, that teaching the hollow road required a different kind of patience than walking it alone. A patience stretched not across his own progress, but across the uneven, unpredictable progress of three separate students, each moving at their own pace, each requiring guidance shaped specifically to their particular nature. Chen Wei progressed fastest, his natural stillness translating quickly into the first faint threads of awareness, the same cool silk sensation Wei Liang remembered from his own first contact. By the end of the second week, the boy could hold a state of genuine internal quiet for nearly an hour without strain, a capability that had taken Wei Liang considerably longer to develop at the same age. Tang Jun struggled. His restlessness, the same stubbornness that had carried him 200 li alone, fought against the patient emptiness the practice required. Wei Liang recognized the pattern, a person whose survival had depended on relentless forward motion, finding it almost physically painful to simply stop and wait. "You do not need to fight for this," Wei Liang told him, on a difficult afternoon when Tang Jun's frustration had become visible in his clenched jaw and restless hands. "Everything you have survived until now, you survived by pushing. This is different. This asks you to stop pushing, just for the length of a single breath, and see what happens when you simply allow rather than force." "I do not know how to do that," Tang Jun admitted, with the particular rawness of someone confessing a real limitation rather than a temporary frustration. "Neither did I," Wei Liang said. "I learned it from 12 years of being told to stay still and small because the world had decided I deserved nothing more. It is not a skill I am proud of having learned through that particular path. But I learned it, and what I learned you can learn too, through a kinder route than mine, because you have me to guide you rather than only your own desperate trial and error." Ah Mei's progress was the most quietly remarkable. Her initial wariness, once Wei Liang understood its source, a childhood spent being told repeatedly and explicitly that she was less than her rooted peers, transformed, with patient encouragement, into something he recognized as a particular gift. She listened to her own internal sensations with unusual precision, having spent years learning to read the subtle cues of which adults in her life were safe and which were not. That same precision, redirected toward her own inner stillness, made her surprisingly sensitive to the faintest threads of awareness once her initial fear eased enough to let her try. By the end of the first month, all three had felt something, faint, inconsistent, easily lost, but real. Wei Liang watched each small breakthrough with a satisfaction that surprised him in its depth, a different quality than his own personal advancement had ever produced. This was not his road widening. It was 3 new roads beginning to exist where, a month ago, the world had insisted none could. Chapter 83: Song Fei's Other Students. While Wei Liang worked with his 3 rootless students, the school's other 40 disciples continued their training in the stone and voice method under Song Fei and her 2 junior instructors. And Wei Liang found himself, in quieter moments, observing their training with genuine interest. The method was, as Song Fei had described in her letter, a careful blend of her ancestors' original 260-year-old curriculum, and the patient, individualized attention she had absorbed from watching the Hollow Roads practice. It produced, Y. Liang observed, students with an unusual combination of traditional earth and water competence and a deeper, more reflective relationship with their own cultivation than he typically saw in conventionally trained sect disciples. "You have built something distinctive," he told Song Fei, one evening as they shared tea in the school's modest dining hall after the day's lessons concluded. "I have built something necessary," she corrected gently. "My ancestors' school was destroyed because it taught Kai as something more than the five-element framework's rigid categories, even before the war Y. Liang found documented in the mountains, even before anyone understood the full history of what was lost. I am trying to honor that original instinct, now that I finally understand what it was reaching toward, while also building something that can survive in the world as it currently exists, not the world as it was 3,000 years ago before any of this was settled." "A bridge," Y. Liang said. "Yes, exactly that." She sipped her tea. "The five-element framework is not going away, nor should it. It serves real purposes, teaches real skills, supports real communities of practitioners who deserve a structured, learnable path. What I am trying to build is a school that respects that framework's genuine usefulness while also keeping a door open to what lies beneath it, for those students ready and willing to look." Y. Liang thought of the ancient battlefield's testimony, the war between organization and the unstructured truth, the centuries of suppression that had followed the organizing faction's victory. "You are doing what I could not do alone," he said. "Building something that holds both truths at once, rather than insisting one must replace the other." "I had a great deal of help understanding how," Song Fei said, with the particular warmth she reserved for moments of genuine gratitude. "You broke the door open. I am simply trying to make sure it stays open in a form sturdy enough to last." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, the evening settling over the school's courtyard, the distant sound of students finishing their final exercises of the day drifting through the open windows. "How are your three?" Song Fei asked eventually. "Beginning," Y. Liang said. "Slowly, unevenly, exactly as they should be. I think given enough years, all three will walk further than I expect right now. They have something I never had at their age." "What is that?" "Proof that it is possible before they even start," he said. "I had to discover that proof through years of solitary desperation. They have me, standing in front of them, as evidence. That changes everything about how fast doubt can be overcome." Chapter 84, A Visit from Y. Ru. Y. Ru arrived at the school unannounced, 4 months into Y. Liang's residence there, having finally completed her inner disciple examinations at the Azure Hollow sect, and claimed, for the first time in years, a stretch of genuinely free time to spend as she chose. Y. Liang felt her Kai signature at the school's outer gate before Song Fei's disciples announced the visitor. The familiar steady brown pulse of an earth root he had not sensed directly in 5 years. Since a sect assessor's testing stone had glowed for her in a village he barely recognized as his own past anymore. She had changed considerably, taller, with the settled confidence of someone who had earned a difficult promotion through genuine competence rather than privilege, and a directness in her bearing that the careful, watchful 10-year-old he remembered had only hinted at. "You look well," she said, when they finally stood face to face in the school's courtyard, the awkwardness of 5 years' separation, and an unusual, complicated history settling between them, in a way that neither rushed to resolve. "So do you," he said, and meant it. "Inner disciple. That is no small accomplishment. It took longer than it should have," she said, with a wry honesty he appreciated. "My association with you, once it became known, required some careful navigation within the sect. Several elders questioned my judgment in continuing to correspond with a ghost cultivator, even after the register made clear what the Bureau actually was. Old habits of suspicion do not vanish simply because new evidence arrives. I am sorry that cost you anything. Do not be, she said firmly. I chose it with full understanding of the cost because it was right. I would choose it again. The elders who questioned my judgment have mostly come around since the Oversight Committee's work became public knowledge. A few have not, and likely never will. I have made my peace with that asymmetry. They walked together through the school's courtyard as Wei Liang showed her the hall of carved names, the training grounds where Chen Wei, Tang Jun, and may practice their slow, patient stillness, the modest but growing infrastructure of an institution that, 4 months ago, had existed only as Song Fei's carefully preserved memory and a stack of founding documents. I wanted to see this, Wei Ru said, standing before the carved walls, reading names she had no personal connection to with the particular respectful attention of someone who understood, intellectually and now viscerally, what those names represented. I read about the register, about the assembly, about everything that happened. But reading about it and standing in a place built from its consequences are different things. They are, Wei Liang agreed. She turned to look at him directly. I am glad I wrote those letters, she said. I was frightened, both times, that I was making a mistake that would cost more than I could afford. I do not regret either letter, not for a moment, but I want you to know it was not easy. I know, he said. It mattered enormously, both times. I do not think I tell people often enough how much their courage at the right moment changes everything that follows. Chapter 85, What Wei Ru Brought. Wei Ru stayed at the school for 5 days, and on the third evening, after the students had retired and only Wei Liang, Song Fei, and Wei Ru remained in the dining hall, she produced something from her travel pack that changed the evening's quiet mood considerably. The Azure Hollow Sex Archive, she said, placing a sealed scroll case on the table between them, has records going back almost 600 years. After the register became public, our sect leadership commissioned a full internal review, partly out of genuine reconsideration, partly, I suspect, out of fear that something worse might be found if they did not look first. What did they find? Song Fei asked, leaning forward with the particular alertness of a historian sensing new material. Among other things, Wei Ru said, records of a sect elder 400 years ago who was quietly expelled for what the archive describes only as unsanctioned theoretical work concerning the nature of elemental Kai. No further detail survives in the official record. The actual research was apparently destroyed at the time. But there is a personal letter, preserved separately by a sympathetic colleague, that the recent review uncovered in a forgotten storage annex. She opened the scroll case carefully and withdrew a single, carefully preserved page, the characters faded but legible. I copied it precisely before leaving, she said. I thought you, of all people, should see it. Wei Liang read the fragment slowly. It was brief, clearly torn from a longer letter, but unmistakable in its content. A cultivator named Elder Zhuang, writing to an unnamed colleague, describing research into what the letter called the undivided root beneath the 5 branches, a phrase that mapped directly onto the ancient battlefield testimony's description of the single current beneath the 5-element framework's branches. 400 years ago, Wei Liang said slowly, and within the Azure Hollow sect itself, someone else had found a thread of the same truth, and was destroyed for it, Wei Ru said quietly. Quietly, without the kind of dramatic suppression the register documented in the Bureau's later, more systematic operations. Just expelled, erased, forgotten, the ordinary, unremarkable violence of an institution protecting its comfortable assumptions. Song Fei was quiet for a long moment, studying the fragment with careful attention. How many more like this exist? She said finally, not quite a question, scattered through sect archives across the continent. waiting for someone to look with the right understanding to recognize what they actually represent. I do not know, Wai Ru said, but I intend to find out. The Sex Review Commission has given me limited access to continue searching, partly because my involvement in exposing the Bureau has given me an unusual credibility on this specific subject, even among elders who remain uncomfortable with the broader implications. Wai Liang looked at the fragment again, at Elder Zhuang's careful, doomed phrase, the undivided root beneath the 5 branches, written 400 years before he himself had stood in the Iron Mirror Fortress and proven the phrase true. Keep looking, he said. Every name you find is someone who deserves to be remembered properly, the way Song Fei's carved walls remember the 2 students who came back. Chapter 86. The First Threads. 6 months into Wai Liang's residence at the school, Chen Wai felt his first true thread of the hollow. It happened during an ordinary afternoon practice session, the boy sitting in his usual spot in the Hall of Carved Names, working through the patient stillness Wai Liang had spent half a year carefully cultivating in him. Wai Liang, sitting nearby with Tang Jun and Mei in their own parallel practices, felt the shift in Chen Wai's Kai signature before the boy himself fully registered it. A faint, cool thread, drawn across the inside of his stillness, the way silk might be drawn across an open palm. Chen Wai's eyes opened slowly, an expression of careful, disbelieving wonder spreading across his serious young face. I felt something, he said, his voice quiet, almost afraid to disturb whatever had just occurred. I know, Wai Liang said. I felt it too. Tell me what it was like cool silk. Chen Wai said slowly, working to find words for something that resisted easy description, exactly as Wai Liang remembered struggling to do himself, 5 years and a lifetime ago. Drawn across the inside of my hand, except my hand was not actually moving. Wai Liang felt something move through him that he had not fully anticipated feeling, a profound, almost overwhelming satisfaction, different in kind from anything his own advancement had produced. This was not his road. This was a road he had helped build, watching someone else's first step land exactly where it needed to. That is exactly right, he said. That is exactly how it began for me, on a boulder in the Broken Tooth Mountains, 5 years ago. You have just felt the first thread of the hollow road, Chen Wai. It will fade, the way mine did, and you may not feel it again for weeks. But it was real, and now you know it is real, which changes everything about how you practice from here forward. Tang Jun and Mei had stopped their own practice, watching this exchange with expressions that mixed genuine joy for their friend with a complicated undercurrent of their own continued struggle. Wai Liang noticed this immediately, and addressed it directly rather than letting it fester unspoken. Chen Wai's thread does not mean either of you are failing, he said, looking between Tang Jun and Mei. Every person's road opens at its own pace, shaped by their own particular nature. I have watched all 3 of you closely for 6 months, and I promise you, with complete honesty, that both of you are progressing in ways that will matter enormously, even though they look different from what just happened to Chen Wai. Tang Jun nodded, though his expression remained complicated. Mei, characteristically more direct about her own feelings, simply said, "It is hard not to feel behind." I know, Wai Liang said. I felt exactly that, watching other cultivators with proper spirit roots advance through stages I could not even attempt. The feeling does not go away simply because I tell you it should. But I can tell you from direct experience that the comparison is the wrong measure. The only useful measure is whether you are further along your own road today than you were yesterday. By that measure, both of you are exactly where you should be. Chapter 87. Letters from the Compact. Yu Qing's letters arrived regularly throughout Wai Liang's months at the school. Each one a careful, detailed account of the open channel, Compact's steady, unglamorous progress. New lineages documented and submitted for reclassification. Ongoing negotiations with the Oversight Committee over the precise scope of the Bureau's continued authority. The slow, patient work of building something durable out of the wreckage of what had tried to destroy her. Her seventh letter, arriving in early winter, carried news that made Wei Liang set down his tea and read it twice before responding. Wei Liang, the Oversight Committee has approved, after considerable debate, a formal classification for what we are now calling unstructured cultivation methods, a category distinct from the prohibited classification the Bureau previously applied. Methods in this category are neither approved nor banned by default, but subject to individual review based on demonstrated safety and genuine historical merit. Exactly the framework you and I argued for after the Assembly's initial votes. This is not a complete victory. The category still requires review, still places the burden of proof on practitioners of suppressed methods rather than assuming good faith by default. But it is the first formal acknowledgement, in 600 years of Bureau and pre-Bureau history, that such methods deserve structured consideration rather than automatic suppression. 12 lineages, including the resonant mountain school stone and voice method, and what remains documented of the original hollow road tradition, have already been granted provisional approval under the new category. Elder Fang has been formally appointed to a permanent seat on the Oversight Committee, the first practitioner of a non-5-element exclusive method to hold such a position in the Bureau's entire history. She asked me to tell you that Liu Zian continues her gradual practice carefully, under Bo Hang's close supervision, and has, as of last month, successfully reached the flow's edge 3 additional times without significant channel cost, exactly the gradual, sustainable pattern we hoped her success would establish. Director Kang has resigned her bureau position formally and accepted appointment as the Oversight Committee's independent investigator for historical enforcement actions, a role that exists specifically to continue documenting the full scope of what the Register only partially captured. I do not think either of us expected, when we first met her, that she would become one of the Compact's most valuable allies, but conviction, once it takes root in someone genuinely capable, tends to produce exactly this kind of unexpected dedication. I am building something that I believe will outlast both of us, Wei Liang, and I wanted you to know, amid all the careful institutional language this letter requires, that I think of you often, and that the work feels less like obligation and more like purpose specifically because you are part of why it exists. You King. Wei Liang read the final paragraph several times, feeling something warm and uncomplicated settle into him in a way that the institutional progress, significant as it was, had not quite produced on its own. He wrote his reply that evening by lamplight, with considerably more care than his usual correspondence required. Chapter 88. Winter at the School. Winter settled over the southern foothills with a gentleness that Wei Liang had not expected, having spent most of his life in the harsher climate of the Broken Tooth Mountains. The school's courtyard, dusted occasionally with light snow, took on a particular quiet beauty that suited the patient, reflective practice Wei Liang continued to develop in his 3 students. Tang Jun's breakthrough came in deep winter, on a morning cold enough that his breath misted visibly in the Hall of Carved Names. It arrived differently than Chen Wei's had, not a single dramatic thread, but a gradual building pressure that the boy described, afterward, as finally learning to stop fighting something that had been trying to reach him for months. It felt like I had been holding a door shut without realizing it, he told Wei Liang, his usual restless energy replaced for the moment with a settled wonder. And today, I finally noticed my own hand on the door and let go. That is a remarkably precise description, Wei Liang said, genuinely impressed. Better than anything I managed to articulate at your stage. Mei's progress remained the slowest of the three, a fact that Wei Liang addressed directly and often, watching carefully for any sign that her old wariness, her old conviction that she was less than her peers, might be reasserting itself under the pressure of comparison. "I am not failing," she said to him one evening with a directness that suggested she had been working up to saying it for some time. "I know you keep telling me that, and I believe you mean it. But I want you to know that I know it too now, not just because you say it, but because I have started to feel it myself. Tell me," Wei Liang said, settling in to listen with his full attention, the way he tried to for each of his students whenever they offered him something this honest. "My stillness is different from Chen Wei's and Tang Jun's," she said. "I noticed it watching them describe their thresholds. Chen Wei's was sudden, like a thread. Tang Jun's was like releasing a door. Mine has been building so slowly and so quietly that I almost did not notice it was happening at all, the way you do not notice a candle slowly burning down until you look up and realize how much time has passed." Wei Liang considered this carefully. "That is its own valid shape," he said. "I have read in the ancient testimony I found that different practitioners' first contact with the hollow takes different forms, shaped by their particular nature, exactly as different rivers carve different shapes through different stone. Your slow, quiet building may, in fact, produce something more stable in the long term than a sudden thread, precisely because it never had a dramatic moment that could be mistaken for completion." May considered this with her characteristic careful attention. "I think," she said slowly, "I might already be feeling it. Just very, very quietly." Wei Liang extended his sense gently toward her, careful not to overwhelm or interfere, and found, to his genuine delight, that she was right. The faintest, most delicate thread he had ever sensed in a beginning practitioner, so subtle it had nearly escaped even his own trained awareness. "You are right," he said. "It is there, quiet but real. Exactly as real as Chen Wei's thread or Tang Jun's released door." Mei's face, for the first time since Wei Liang had met her, broke into an expression of uncomplicated, undefended joy. Chapter 89. A Difficult Question. Tang Jun asked the question that Wei Liang had been quietly expecting for months, on a clear evening in early spring as the school's first plum blossoms began opening in the courtyard outside. "The 10th stage," he said, finding Wei Liang alone in the garden after the evening meal. "You mentioned it once, months ago, almost in passing. I have thought about it since. Will you reach it? And if you do, what happens to us, to your students, while you are gone walking toward it?" Wei Liang considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, recognizing in it both Tang Jun's genuine concern and the particular anxiety of someone whose stability had, for the first time in his life, depended on another person's continued presence. "I do not know if I will reach it," he said honestly. "The ancient testimony describes it as requiring a decade of mastery beyond the 9th stage, which I achieved less than a year ago. I am, by the testimony's own accounting, perhaps 9 years from even being ready to properly attempt it, and the attempt itself carries no guarantee of success." "But you intend to try, eventually, yes, when the time is right and not a moment before." Wei Liang looked at the plum blossoms, pale and fragile against the evening sky. "But Tang Jun, I want you to understand something clearly. 9 years is a very long time. You will likely have reached stages of your own practice I cannot currently predict, possibly stages I have not even reached myself, by the time any of this becomes urgent. I am not planning to vanish into solitary preparation tomorrow, abandoning what we are building here. But eventually you will need to," Tang Jun pressed, with the particular stubbornness that Wei Liang had come to recognize as the boy's deepest and most valuable quality, properly redirected from blind forward motion into genuine, careful concern. The ninth stage took you 4 years of nearly constant work. The 10th sounds like it could take longer. It might, Wei Liang agreed. And when that time comes, I will not abandon you, any of you, without preparation. Song Fei will continue to guide the school's broader curriculum. You and Chen Wei and may will by then have years of foundational practice behind you, likely enough to begin guiding newer students yourselves, the way senior disciples in any tradition eventually take on teaching responsibilities. And I do not intend to disappear entirely. The 10th stage, from everything I understand of it, does not require permanent isolation, only sustained, careful practice alongside whatever else my life continues to hold. Tang Jun was quiet for a moment, processing this. I am not only worried for myself, he said eventually, with the particular honesty that had become, over the months, entirely characteristic of him. I am worried because you are the only proof we have that this road is real. If something happened to you, attempting something this dangerous, what would that mean for the rest of us? Wei Liang felt the weight of this question settle into him fully, recognizing in it something he had not fully confronted himself, that he was no longer simply walking his own road, free to risk it however he chose. He was now, whether he had sought the role or not, evidence that other people's hope depended upon. That is a fair and important concern, he said slowly. I will think about it carefully, and I promise you I will not attempt the 10th stage recklessly, the way the ancient practitioner who left the cache apparently did, dying before completing the work. Whatever I attempt, I will attempt with the same patience that has carried me this far, and with people I trust present to help if something goes wrong, exactly as Liu Xian's attempt was supported by 11 practitioners rather than undertaken alone. Chapter 90, 1 year. On the anniversary of his arrival at the Resonant Mountain School, Wei Liang stood once more in the Hall of Carved Names, watching his 3 students practice in the late afternoon light, and took stock of a year that had reshaped his understanding of what the road actually meant. Chen Wei, now 14, had progressed to what Wei Liang assessed as a stable second-stage equivalent, his natural aptitude for stillness translating into steady, reliable advancement that suggested, given continued years of patient work, genuine future capability rivaling Wei Liang's own early progress. Tang Jun, 16 now, had found in his released door a foundation that suited his particular temperament, channeling his old restless energy into a focused, almost fierce dedication to practice that Wei Liang recognized, with some private amusement, as remarkably similar to his own early desperation, transformed now into something healthier by the simple presence of genuine support and community. May 12 continued her quiet, careful building, her slow thread deepening steadily into something that Wei Liang increasingly suspected might prove, in the long run, the most stable foundation of the 3, exactly as he had told her it might. Song Fei's broader school had grown to 61 students, with 2 more junior instructors trained and a 3rd under consideration, the institution settling into a sustainable rhythm that no longer depended entirely on Song Fei's own limited capacity. The letters from Yu King continued to arrive regularly, charting the open channel compact's steady, unglamorous progress, each one ending now with a warmth that both of them had stopped pretending was purely professional. Wei Ru's searches through sect archives had, over the year, uncovered 4 more fragments of suppressed pre-sect knowledge, each one carefully documented and added to the growing body of evidence that the ancient war's true history was finally being recovered, piece by careful piece, from centuries of deliberate erasure. Shen Guo's letters, arriving less frequently but always welcome, described a quiet life at the inn, the Copper Ridge serpent aging gracefully. 2 new residents who had found their way to the shelter through the sign networks continued operation. Wei Liang sat that evening on a low wall outside the Hall of Carved Names, watching the last light fade over the southern foothills, and thought about the boy who had once sat on a different boulder, in a different mountain range, reading a single damaged book, and deciding that the word offense implied a choice he did not actually have. He had been right about that, all those years ago. The choice had never been the one the world insisted he had, between accepting a closed door or breaking himself against it uselessly. The actual choice, the one he had stumbled into through nothing more than stubborn necessity, had been quieter and larger than either option, to walk patiently, one careful step at a time, until the door that had never truly been locked simply opened, because enough hollow space had finally pressed against it long enough to find the give. 9 years, perhaps, until the 10th stage became a real question rather than a distant possibility. 3 students walking their own roads behind him, certain now in a way he had never been certain, because they had him as living proof. A network of allies and friends spread across half a continent, each building something that would outlast any single person's effort. The road had never belonged to him alone. It had only felt that way during the years he walked it in solitary necessity, before anyone else knew it was there to be walked. He looked up at the first stars appearing over the southern foothills, the same patient sky that had watched over every step of the past 6 years, and felt, with a clarity that had taken the whole of those 6 years to earn, something he had no name for as a child scrubbing flagstones in a village that told him he had no future. He felt, simply and completely, at home in his own life. Tomorrow, there would be more teaching, more letters, more patient steps along a road that stretched ahead of him for years yet, toward a 10th stage that remained, for now, a careful and distant hope rather than an immediate demand. That was enough. That was, he had come to understand, exactly what enough was supposed to feel like. He rose from the wall as the evening settled fully into night, and walked back toward the hall where Chen Wei, Tang Jun, and Ah Mei were finishing their evening practice, ready to spend one more patient day teaching 3 children that the roads the world called closed were, more often than anyone wanted to admit, simply roads that no one had yet walked far enough to find where they opened. Chapter 91. 2 more years. Time, Wei Liang discovered, moved differently when measured in patient cultivation than it had moved during the desperate, accelerated years of his own rise. 2 more years passed at the resonant mountain school with a quality of unhurried accumulation that felt, in retrospect, both swift and substantial. Chen Wei, now 16, had reached what Wei Liang assessed as a stable 4th stage equivalent, his natural aptitude having matured into genuine skill through sustained, careful practice. He had also, in the past year, begun helping Song Fei's junior instructors with the school's youngest arrivals, a responsibility he approached with the same serious dedication he brought to his own cultivation. Tang Jun, 18 now, had channeled his old restlessness into something Wei Liang found genuinely admirable. A fierce, focused practice that had carried him to a comparable stage despite a later start, alongside a growing reputation among the school's other students as someone who could be relied upon. A far cry from the desperate, solitary boy who had walked 200 li on stubbornness alone. Ah Mei, 14, continued to surprise everyone, including herself, with the depth her quiet, patient building had achieved. Her thread, so faint in its first appearance that Wei Liang had needed his full trained sense to detect it, had deepened into something he now recognized as unusually stable, exactly as he had once predicted it might. The school itself had grown to 93 students under Song Fei's expanding leadership, with 5 trained junior instructors now sharing the teaching burden across both the traditional stone and voice curriculum. and an increasingly formalized introductory hollow road program that Liang had spent considerable effort designing. Careful to preserve the individualized attention the path required even as it scaled beyond what any single teacher could manage alone. Liang's own practice continued in the careful, unhurried background of his teaching responsibilities. He spent each dawn in deep meditation, working through the specific preparations the ancient testimony described as necessary groundwork for the 10th stage, not advancing the 9 stages further, which were already complete and stable, but deepening his relationship with the primordial flow's permanent residue, learning its textures and rhythms with the same patient attention he had once given to his very first faint thread on a mountain boulder. He visited Yu-King in the prefectural capital twice during these 2 years, each visit a comfortable, easy continuation of a bond that had long since stopped requiring careful definition. He visited Shen Guo's Inn once, finding the old man well, the Copper Ridge serpent older but still alert, the shelter still quietly operating for whoever needed its particular kind of patient refuge. The world beyond the school continued its own slow transformation. The Oversight Committee's work proceeded with the particular grinding patience of genuine institutional reform, neither as fast as the most hopeful had wanted nor as stalled as the most cynical had predicted. Chapter 92: The Compact's Growing Reach. Yu-King's letters during these years charted a transformation that Liang found genuinely remarkable to witness even from a distance. The Open Channel Compact, which had begun as little more than a documentation project and a network of contacts, had grown into something with real institutional weight. Her 9th letter, arriving in the 2nd year, described the Compact's first formal congress, a gathering of representatives from 41 recognized unstructured lineages, more than triple the number documented at the organization's founding. The Congress had established, among other things, a shared curriculum standards body, a mutual aid fund for practitioners facing institutional discrimination, and a formal liaison relationship with the Oversight Committee that gave previously suppressed traditions a genuine voice in their own regulatory future. Director Kang's investigations into historical bureau enforcement actions had, by the 2nd year, documented and formally acknowledged over 600 individual cases of excessive or unjustified suppression. Each one entered into a permanent public record that Yu-King described as slowly but surely reshaping how the wider cultivation world understood its own history. Ru's archive searches had, by the 2nd year, uncovered 11 more fragments of pre-sect and early sect era suppressed knowledge across 6 different major sects' historical records, each fragment carefully documented, cross-referenced, and added to a growing scholarly body of work that Song Fei, with her historian's careful instincts, had begun calling the recovered testimony, a name that had, through the contact network's organic spread, become the field's accepted term. Elder Fang's seat on the Oversight Committee had, over 2 years, become a genuine center of gravity for reform-minded sects, drawing 4 additional mid-tier sects into active collaboration with the Compact's documentation efforts, expanding the network of allies in ways that no single dramatic confrontation could have achieved. Liu Zion, Liang learned through Elder Fang's own occasional letters, had continued her gradual, careful practice toward the single current's deeper reaches, now able to sustain contact with the flow for nearly 5 minutes at a time, still without significant channel damage, a pace of safe advancement that suggested her gentler, supported path might, given enough patient years, prove genuinely sustainable in ways Liang's own forced, solitary road never could have been. Reading all of this, gathered across years of careful correspondence, Liang found himself struck by a particular realization: the dramatic, dangerous events at the Iron Mirror Fortress, which had felt, in the moment, like the climax of everything he had worked toward, had actually been only the opening of a much longer, much quieter story. The real transformation was happening here, in the patient, unglamorous accumulation of documentation, curriculum, mutual aid, and institutional trust building, year after careful year. Chapter 93. A difficult case. Not every development during these years was straightforwardly positive, a fact Wei Liang was reminded of sharply when a desperate letter arrived from a practitioner he had never met, forwarded through the contact network with an urgency marker that immediately commanded his full attention. The letter came from a young man named Hu Zhen, 20 years old, practicing an unstructured wood-aspected method he had developed independently after his own conventional spirit route proved too weak for his sex-standard curriculum. He had been documented and granted provisional approval under the Compact's new unstructured methods classification 8 months earlier. Now, his letter explained with barely controlled panic, he had attempted to advance his self-developed method beyond its tested boundaries, and something had gone severely wrong. His meridians were destabilizing, a slow, creeping deterioration that the Compact's network physicians, consulted urgently, could not fully diagnose or treat. Wei Liang left the school within the hour, traveling at a pace that drew on every efficiency his transparent body stage afforded him, reaching Hu Zhen's location, a small mid-tier sex guest quarters 3 days distant, faster than conventional travel should have allowed. What he found upon arrival was a young man in genuine distress, his meridians showing the particular ragged quality Wei Liang recognized immediately from his own early years of trial and dangerous error, before the nameless river method had given him a properly tested framework to follow. "I thought I understood the principle well enough to extend it," Hu Zhen said, his voice tight with pain and fear in roughly equal measure. "I was wrong. I do not know how to undo what I have done." Wei Liang spent 6 hours working with him, using his sixth-stage sense to map the full extent of the damage and his own hard-won understanding of channel structure to begin the careful, patient work of stabilization. It was, he reflected as he worked, precisely the kind of danger the ancient testimony had warned against. Unstructured methods offered genuine freedom, but that freedom came without the safety rails that centuries of refined, tested 5-element curricula provided by default. By the following morning, Hu Zhen was stable, though Wei Liang's honest assessment suggested a partial, permanent reduction in the young man's cultivation capacity, similar in kind though smaller in degree to what Wei Liang himself had sustained at the Iron Mirror Fortress. "I am sorry," Wei Liang told him, with complete honesty. "I wish I could have reached you sooner, or that the Compact's documentation work had already produced clearer safety guidance for self-developed methods specifically. This is exactly the kind of danger we need to address more systematically, not just for your sake, but for everyone walking similarly uncharted ground." Chapter 94. Building Safety into Freedom. Hu Zhen's near disaster became, in the weeks that followed, the catalyst for a project Wei Liang had known was necessary, but had not yet found the urgency to prioritize: a formal safety framework for unstructured and self-developed cultivation methods, distinct from but complementary to the Compact's existing documentation and reclassification work. He wrote to Yu King immediately, laying out what he had seen in Hu Zhen's case and the broader pattern it represented. "Yu King, the freedom we have fought to establish for unstructured methods carries a genuine danger that we have not yet adequately addressed. Practitioners working without the centuries of refined safety knowledge that 5-element curricula provide by default are vulnerable to exactly the kind of self-inflicted harm I just spent 6 hours helping Hu Zhen survive. I believe the Compact needs a formal safety review body, staffed by practitioners with direct experience across multiple unstructured traditions, capable of reviewing self-developed methods before practitioners attempt dangerous extensions alone, the way Hu Zhen did. This is not about reimposing the kind of restrictive control the Bureau once wielded. It is about building genuine, voluntary safety infrastructure that protects practitioners' freedom by also protecting their well-being. I would like to help design this body, drawing on what I have learned through my own dangerous trial and error, and what the Drifting Pine Sect's careful, gradual approach to Liu Xian's practice demonstrated about how safety and genuine advancement can coexist. Wai Liang, her response arrived within the week, characteristically swift and precise. Wai Liang, I agree completely, and I am somewhat frustrated with myself for not prioritizing this sooner. We have spent 2 years focused on winning recognition and reclassification. Important work, but work that has perhaps let us neglect the equally important question of what practitioners do safely once that recognition is won. I am calling an emergency session of the Compact's Curriculum Standards body to begin designing the safety review framework you describe. I want you present, both for your direct experience and because practitioners across our network trust your judgment in a way that will matter enormously for the framework's credibility. 3 months. Can you arrange coverage for your students at the school for that period? Yu King Wai Liang spoke with Song Fei that same evening and found her immediately and enthusiastically supportive. Chen Wai and Tang Jun are both ready for more responsibility, she said. I have been waiting for the right moment to formally expand their teaching role. This is exactly that moment. Go. Build the safety framework. Your students here will be in good hands, including, I suspect, increasingly their own. Chapter 95, 3 months in the capital. Wai Liang spent the following 3 months in the prefectural capital, working alongside Yu King and a carefully assembled committee of senior practitioners from across the Compact's network. Bao Hang, representing the Mountain Quiet Method's gradual, supported approach. Director Kang, bringing her unique perspective on institutional failure patterns from her former bureau career. 2 physicians from the contact network, who had treated more cultivation-related injuries than perhaps anyone else in the prefecture. And, surprising Wai Liang considerably, Hu Zhen himself, who had insisted on contributing his own painful experience directly to the framework's design. I want what happened to me to mean something beyond my own loss. Hu Zhen explained on the committee's first day, his meridians still healing, his cultivation still diminished from what it had been. If my mistake helps prevent the same mistake in someone else, that is not nothing. The work itself was detailed, technical, and genuinely difficult in ways that surprised Wai Liang, who had expected his own direct experience to translate more easily into systematic framework design than it actually did. The problem, he said, on a frustrating afternoon 3 weeks into the process, after a particularly difficult debate over how to assess novel meridian configurations without imposing the kind of rigid standardization that had originally suppressed unstructured methods, is that every safety principle we draft risks becoming exactly the kind of restrictive box the Bureau once built, just with better intentions. Then we draft principles, not rules, Director Kang said, with the particular clarity that her institutional experience consistently provided. The Bureau's failure was never having safety standards. It was treating those standards as fixed, permanent, unquestionable law rather than living guidance subject to ongoing revision as understanding improves. We build a framework that explicitly expects to be wrong sometimes and explicitly commits to revision when it is. This reframing, simple as it sounded, unlocked weeks of subsequent progress. The committee began drafting not a rigid rulebook, but a living set of safety principles. recommended practices for testing novel method extensions incrementally rather than attempting large jumps, as Hu Zhen had. A voluntary peer review process where practitioners could submit self-developed methods for experienced review before attempting dangerous advancement alone. A network of trained emergency responders, distributed across the compact's growing geographic reach, capable of providing exactly the kind of urgent stabilization Wei Liang had given Hu Zhen, but without requiring Wei Liang himself to travel days at exhausting speed every time. By the end of the 3 months, the framework existed in a complete, if explicitly provisional, form, the compact safety principles, ready for formal adoption and, crucially, ready for the ongoing revision Director Kang had insisted upon from the start. Chapter 96. What grew between them? The 3 months in the prefectural capital gave Wei Liang and Yu Qing something they had rarely had across the preceding years of correspondence and brief, purposeful visits, sustained daily proximity, unburdened by immediate crisis. They worked together through long committee days, shared meals in the comfortable, easy silence that had always characterized their best moments together, and found, gradually, that the warmth which had been building quietly in their letters for years had room, finally, to become something neither of them needed to carefully describe in writing. It was Yu Qing, characteristically, who named it directly, on an evening walk along the river that ran through the capital's eastern district, the same kind of river that had run beside so many of their shared moments across the years. "I have spent 4 years," she said, "building precise, careful arguments for institutions, and I find I do not have a precise, careful argument for this. I simply know that I do not want to keep pretending our letters are only professional correspondence, when we both know they have not been that for some time." Wei Liang considered this with the same careful honesty he brought to every significant question in his life, and found, when he examined it fully, that his answer required no deliberation at all. "I do not want to pretend that either," he said. "I think I have known for at least 2 years, since the crossroads where we parted ways toward the Drifting Pine sect and the Southern School, that what exists between us is not only the comfortable partnership of shared purpose. I did not say it then, because the work felt too large and too urgent to risk complicating with anything that might distract from it. And now, I think the work has taught me that the people walking it alongside you are not a distraction from its purpose," he said. "They are, perhaps, the actual point of it. I built the road so that people would not have to walk it as alone as I once did. I do not think I fully understood, until this moment, that this includes not walking it alone myself." They stood together by the river as evening settled fully into night, the particular quiet satisfaction of a long-building truth finally spoken aloud settling comfortably between them, requiring, for once, no further careful argument or institutional language to make itself understood. "The safety framework will be finished within the week," Yu Qing said eventually, practical even in this moment, though with a softness in her voice that had not been there in her earlier institutional reports. "After that, I imagine you will want to return to the school to Chen Wei and Tang Jun and Ah Mei." "I will," he said. "And I imagine you will continue building the compact's reach here and across the network." "I will," she agreed. "But the distance between those 2 roads," he said, "no longer needs to mean what it might have meant before tonight." She smiled, the particular precise, warm smile that had become, over years of friendship and partnership, entirely her own. "No," she agreed, "it does not." Chapter 97. Return to the school. Wei Liang returned to the Resonant Mountain School in late autumn, 3 months after he had left, to find Chen Wei and Tang Jun both formally established as junior instructors under Song Fei's expanded teaching structure, each handling a small cohort of newer Hollow Road students with a careful, patient competence that filled Wei Liang with a particular pride distinct from anything his own advancement had ever produced. "They did not need me as much as I worried they would," he admitted to Song Fei, watching Chen Wei guide 3 new students through the same first lesson of stillness Wei Liang had once taught him. "They needed you to build the foundation," Song Fei said. "They did not need you to remain the only one standing on it. That is, I think, the mark of teaching done well. The students eventually require less of the teacher, not more." Mei, now 15, had advanced further in his absence than Wei Liang had expected, her quiet, patient building having reached what he assessed as a genuinely remarkable depth for her age and experience, rivaling Chen Wei's more naturally gifted progress through sheer sustained dedication. "I kept practicing every day you were gone," she told him, with the particular quiet pride of someone who had proven something important to herself as much as to anyone else. "I did not want my progress to depend on you being here to watch it happen." "That is exactly the independence the road is meant to build," Wei Liang said. "I am genuinely proud of you, Mei, not simply for the progress itself, but for choosing to make it happen without requiring my presence as a precondition." The school itself had grown further during his absence, now approaching 110 students, its reputation having spread through the contact network, and, increasingly, through more conventional channels as the oversight committee's reforms made unstructured cultivation methods a steadily less fraught subject of public discussion. Wei Liang spent his first weeks back settling into the rhythm of teaching once more, while also beginning to formally implement the compact's new safety principles within the school's own growing Hollow Road curriculum, ensuring that the next generation of students, now numbering well over a dozen across various stages of early progress, would have access to systematic safety guidance that he himself had been forced to develop through years of dangerous, solitary trial and error. It was, he reflected during a quiet evening meditation in the Hall of Carved Names, a particular kind of satisfaction to watch the road he had once walked entirely alone become, year by careful year, a road with proper markers, safety rails, and fellow travelers at every stage of the journey. Chapter 98, 5 Years. By the time 5 full years had passed since the Iron Mirror Fortress, a milestone Wei Liang noted quietly to himself rather than marking with any particular ceremony, the transformation across the wider cultivation world had become substantial enough that even practitioners with no direct connection to the compact's work had begun to notice and discuss it. The Still Water Bureau, which had once commanded fear and unquestioned authority across the prefecture, now existed as a genuinely reformed institution, its enforcement powers sharply curtailed, its remaining functions focused, under the Oversight Committee's continued supervision, on legitimate safety concerns rather than commercial monopoly protection. Several of its former senior officers, including Deng Hu, the hunter who had once been sent to apprehend Wei Liang on the Eastern Road, had transitioned into the compact's own safety review structure, bringing genuine expertise to work that no longer required the coercive enforcement they had once been trained for. The open channel compact itself had grown into one of the prefecture's most respected cultivation institutions, its documentation work having recovered and formally recognized over 30 distinct unstructured lineages, its safety principles adopted, in modified form, by sects across the wider region as a genuine improvement on previous, more rigid safety doctrines. Song Fei's resonant mountain school had become, alongside Shen Guo's quiet, ongoing shelter and the drifting pine sect's deepening collaborative work, one of 3 recognized centers for unstructured cultivation training, drawing students from across the prefecture and, increasingly, from neighboring regions that had heard of the work through the network's continued, organic spread. Wai Liang's own students had each found their footing as genuine practitioners in their own right. Chen Wai, now 21, had reached a stage Wai Liang assessed as comparable to his own progress at the same point, with the careful, methodical temperament that suggested a long, stable future of continued advancement. Tang Jun, 23, had channeled his fierce dedication into a teaching role that had, somewhat to his own initial surprise, become as fulfilling to him as his own cultivation progress. Mei, 19, had quietly become one of the school's most capable instructors, her own deep, patient practice serving as a particular inspiration to the school's youngest and most uncertain arrivals, the rootless children who needed, more than anything, proof that patience could eventually become power. Chapter 99. A Quiet Wedding. Wai Liang and Yu King married in the autumn of the 5th year in a ceremony that reflected, with characteristic precision on her part and characteristic simplicity on his, exactly who they had each become. It took place at the Resonant Mountain School, in the courtyard outside the Hall of Carved Names, with Song Fei presiding in her capacity as the school's senior elder and the closest thing either of them had to formal family structure beyond the network of chosen bonds they had built across years of shared purpose. Shen Guo attended, having made the long journey from his inn for the first time in years, the Copper Ridge serpent left in the capable care of the inn's current residents. He looked, Wai Liang thought, watching the old man settle into a seat of honor near the front of the small gathered crowd, genuinely happy in a way that suited his weathered, patient face. Wai Ru attended, now a senior disciple at the Azure Hollow sect with her own growing reputation as the foremost scholar of what the field continued to call the recovered testimony. Her searches having, by this point, uncovered and documented over 30 distinct fragments of suppressed pre-sect knowledge across a dozen different sect archives. Director Kang attended, alongside Deng Hu and several others from the compact safety review structure, a quiet testament to how thoroughly the institutions built from the Iron Mirror Fortress's consequences had become woven into both Wai Liang's and Yu Qing's daily lives. Elder Fang and Bao Hang traveled from the Drifting Pine sect, bringing word that Liu Zion, unable to attend due to her own deepening practice schedule, had sent a carefully composed letter of congratulations along with a small gift, a meditation cushion of the particular quality the mountain quiet tradition used for its most advanced practitioners, a gesture that moved Wai Liang considerably when he understood its significance. Chen Wai, Tang Jun, and Mei stood together near the front, the three of them now firmly established as capable young adults rather than the uncertain children Wai Liang had first met in this same hall, their presence a particular and complete kind of completion to the day's significance. The ceremony itself was simple, brief, and entirely sincere, vows exchanged that reflected in their careful, considered language exactly the partnership the two of them had built across years of shared danger, shared purpose, and shared patient work toward something larger than either of them alone could have achieved. I have spent years building structures meant to outlast any single person's effort, Yu King said, in her own vows, with the particular precision that had never left her even in moments of genuine emotion. I did not expect, when I began that work, that I would also build something meant simply to be shared, day by day, for the rest of however many years we are given. I am glad to have been wrong about the limits of what I was building toward. Wai Liang, in his own vows, found himself returning, as he often did in moments of genuine significance, to the particular clarity the hollow road had taught him across years of patient practice. I spent 12 years of my childhood being told I had no road, he said. I spent 4 years walking one I built alone, out of necessity, with no guarantee it led anywhere worth reaching. I am standing here today because the road, against every expectation the world once gave me, led to exactly this, not power alone, not vindication alone, but you, and the people gathered here, and a life I did not know how to imagine wanting until I had already begun building it. Chapter 100, The Decade's Midpoint. 5 years remained, by the ancient testimonies accounting, before Wei Liang could properly consider attempting the 10th stage, a milestone that no longer felt, as it once had, like a distant and uncertain hope, but like a clear approaching point on a road he had learned, across a decade of patient practice, to walk without forcing. He spent the evening of his wedding day, after the gathered guests had settled into the school's guest quarters for the night, sitting with Yu King in the quiet of the Hall of Carved Names, the two of them simply present together in the particular comfortable silence that had become, across years of partnership, entirely their own. 5 more years, she said, breaking the silence eventually, her hand resting easily in his. Will you be ready when the time comes? I do not know, he said, with the same honest uncertainty he had offered Tang Jun years earlier. But I know I will not face it the way the ancient practitioner who left the cache apparently did, alone and unprepared, dying before completing the work. I will face it with you, with Chen Wei and Tang Jun and Ah Mei, with Shen Guo's guidance and Song Fei's wisdom and Elder Fang's careful collaborative knowledge of the gradual path Liu Zion has proven possible. That sounds like enough preparation for anyone, Yu King said. It is more preparation than I ever expected to have, he agreed. 5 years ago, walking alone toward the Iron Mirror Fortress, I genuinely did not know if I would survive what I was attempting. I do not feel that same uncertainty now, facing the 10th stage. Not because the danger is smaller, but because I am no longer facing it the way I faced everything before, as someone with nothing to lose and no one to lose it for. They sat together a while longer, the carved names watching from every wall around them. 2 centuries and more of remembered struggle and survival pressed into the stone, a permanent testament to everything that had been lost and everything that had, against every expectation, eventually been recovered. Wei Liang thought, in that quiet moment, of the boy he had once been, 12 years old, scrubbing flagstones in a village that told him plainly he had no future worth considering, reading a single damaged book by the light of a setting sun, deciding that the word offense implied a choice he did not actually have. He thought of everything that boy could not have imagined: the Hollow Road's patient 9 stages, the Iron Mirror Fortress, and the Primordial Flow's permanent residue, the Register's thousands of recovered names, the Oversight Committee's slow but genuine reform, the Open Channel Compact's growing institutional weight. 3 students who had become capable teachers in their own right, a wife whose precise, patient strength matched his own in every way that mattered, a network of friends and allies spread across half a continent, each building something that would outlast any single person's individual effort. 5 years remained before the 10th stage's proper attempt. A lifetime remained. He understood now with a clarity the boy on the boulder could never have reached, of continued patient work, teaching new students, supporting the Compact's ongoing growth, deepening his own practice, building, day by careful day, a life that had become, against every early expectation, genuinely and completely his own. The road had never promised an ending. It had only promised, to anyone willing to walk it with sufficient patience, that it would keep opening, one careful step at a time, for as long as the walking continued. Wei Liang understood, sitting in the quiet hall with his wife's hand in his and the carved names watching from every wall, that he intended to keep walking for a very long time yet. Outside, the autumn evening settled fully into night over the southern foothills, the same patient sky stretching above every mountain range he had ever walked beneath, indifferent and vast, and after everything, no longer lonely at all.